Hello, everybody. I'm back doing a little bit of reading. I have a new book today. I'm one of those types of people that goes and they have a big stack of books going at any one time. And so this is one that I actually ordered a while back. Stephen Newcomb had recommended it to me, and he's like, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around all of this. But this is Roger S. Jones's Physics as a Metaphor. And on the back here, it says Roger S. Jones is an associate professor of physics at the University of Minnesota with a fundamental interest in physics, philosophy, and education. And so this is kind of an old book, if you couldn't tell by the the cover art. It was originally copyrighted in 1982, and then this issue was redone in second printing in 1990. So it's been around for a while. And I went back to this because the next project that I'm sort of going to start working on is essentially expanding on some of the research that Stuffers had started around these Voronoi polyhedra and this idea of that the digital twins that are being developed for these simulation modeling protocols, for AI or sugarscape societies aren't going to be just like mini versions of yourself, mini avatars or what have you. They're most likely going to be some sort of crystalline structure with multi-planes that are deforming in topologically certain ways depending on pressure that are being put from social pressure and economic pressures, and all of that's going to be tracked. You want to track all of that on the blockchain for your blockchain avatar. And so I'm going back and looking at some work that I was doing early on around Kurt Lewin, K-U-R-T, and Lewin is L-E-W-I-N. And he spent some time in sort of like organizational theory and group dynamics connected to Tavistock, and then came here to the US and was at MIT, and then briefly at Wharton here in Philadelphia, and then died very young in his 40s. And so he had this idea of psychological field theory and sort of manipulations of, I think, energetics, right? And manipulations of us as deformable energetic objects. And so I'm trying to sort of mesh this with sort of crystallography and hyperspacetime mapping and trying to sort of pin all of this down. And I was looking at, we're building off, I have a piece that should be coming out on Saturday or Sunday about sort of deconstructing that crypto skeptic conference from Stephen Deal and looking at smart contracts and the way in which these contracts that we engage with, either knowingly or not, are going to start reshaping the clustering of our crystalline structures somehow, and how that represents in consciousness. And today we've had a new thread on the discourse about sort of the incorporation of psychedelics into social impact finance and modeling, and the way in which, and they've been at it for a long time, but, deep state, MK Ultra, human potential movement, all of that stuff is going to be sort of segueing into microdosing and, your mental health impact finance bonds. And, of course, keeping it all on blockchain. So it's all going to be, nice and good and quality. So I've been working on that, and then thinking more and more about sort of the space-time stuff. And I'm trying to think, I don't think I have this sort of Edward Dewey's daughter, who worked on this psychotheory. She actually has this book that I got called Laminated Spacetime, which is quite interesting. And that now it must be on a pile that I can't reach. But so the space-time theory is out there because if you imagine this Voronoi polyhedra with all these different planes of different sizes, and that's it, like in a tiny fraction nanosecond, right? Like a picture of it that's contained within a cube at a given tiny fraction of a bit of time. But it's actually most likely deforming all the time, depending on what the simulation model anticipates what it wants you to be to fit into the simulation, to steer you through the digital nudging into the new simulation. And so it really exists in 4D time. So it's like, if you can picture this crystal, like, it's like moving depending on the contracts and being poked and prodded and pulled. And, it's a thing, but it's being stretched and compressed and moved around. And I was thinking about that in relation to these I'm in Philly, and we're not too far from where they have the Thanksgiving Day parade. And our civic association back in the day, they would do a call for balloon wranglers, and so they would need volunteers to come out and like hold the threads for the big balloon things, the not the rolly kind of parade floats, but the balloon floats. And they would need, I don't know, 100 people holding all the tethers of the balloon floats. And I sort of picture this Voronoi diagram like the balloon floats with all these people, like, but not people, it would be algorithms, right? Like pulling on the strings to get it to spin or to do what it's supposed to do. And like sort of the puppets, right? Like the energetic puppets. And anyway, that's what they have in mind. I don't know that, I'm not saying that they're going to accomplish all of that, but I'm thinking about the fourth dimension of time and physics. And so it brought to mind, again, this book, and Stephen Newcomb had recommended it to me a while back, and I had it sitting on the pile. And so I had to go drop my car off to get inspected and take the subway back. And so I had dropped this in my backpack to read. And so I'm just going to start in a minute about space. And I'm going to read this, and it might be a bit complicated, but stick with me or turn it on slow or listen to it a couple times, because I found it really fascinating about humans embedded in the environment. But before I get onto that, I do want to just say a quick little thing that just like, I try to sort of manage social media, like not very effectively. So I have someone, like, I don't get a ton of comments on my blog posts, which, yeah, it is what it is. And we have this discourse, which is, again, a controlled space, but anyone's sort of welcome to look over our shoulders and see what we're up to over there and see if it makes sense. And this person, and I don't know if they'd followed my work for a while or they were just new, but essentially they had come on to my comments and were just like many comments, like, dozen, 15 comments. And some of it was related and some of it was sort of just very broad, but it was almost like using the space as like their own social media space, right? To have all of their ideas about things. But, and they early on had said, like, maybe I would like to do this discourse. And so I asked Jason, I said, go ahead and send them the questionnaire thingy to do the discourse. And I didn't realize he had sent it back to me and that it had bounced back, the email that in the comment section, like it bounced back. And I didn't realize that. So then later on, the person was like, I don't really like that discourse. And I don't really like that it's controlled. And I don't really like these things. And so like I replied back and I said, this is probably not the best space for you to be here. Like if this is how you feel, if you felt uncomfortable with this. And then it bounced back. And the person was changing all of their emails and like leaving all these comments, but clearly was not operating from a like forthright manner. And so, so I just took them off the comments because I'm not really sure who you are or what your intentions are. So when I come on and I ask people to like take charge of this material and think about it and then articulate it in your way, what I'm trying to convey is that this is not my material. This is not my thing. This is our thing. This is the structure that we're interrogating and teasing apart. And whatever you do with this material, it doesn't need to be done within the context of me or anything about me. It should be what makes sense for you with where you are in the structure and how you articulate it out to the people who are around you. So, this person sort of came off like, yeah, you're gatekeepers and you're the most terrible thing of all the social media. And I'm like, listen, in this space, like we manage how we engage with social media. It's not a free-for-all, actually. And it's kind of like if you imagine way back in the day, like 1982, when you read a book, you might underline it and you might take notes and you might share it with friends and you might say, let's have a book group and talk about it. But you didn't necessarily feel entitled to engage with like Roger Jones and get him in real time and start like dinging him with all this stuff. That wasn't an expectation. Like you have ideas, you put them out in the space and then people can either engage with them or not and have it influence their lives or not. And I feel like that's what I'm after, is to provide material to consider if it makes sense to you to consider the material I'm putting out, but not necessarily to like do all of this back and forth stuff. And we do have that space in the discourse, but it is somewhat structured. And yeah, it's not a free for all. So if you're uncomfortable with the idea that it's not a free for all, then go make your group that's the free for all. And totally, like I'm hands off about all of that. So I just want to re-articulate like how I'm engaging with social media now, which is how I've been doing it for a long time. Only like I block people like when they were energetically in spaces that were not good. in relation to what I was trying to accomplish is like, I'm not trying to silence you where you are. Like, if anything, I want more people to be out where they are. And if you concur with me that the structure that I've been looking at about psychological field theory and modeling and AI and gamification and financial markets and evolutionary economics and the noosphere makes sense in a non-ideology, realizing they're playing the whole political spectrum to accomplish this end, yeah, engage with that. You don't need to engage with me. Just engage with it in your own mind and engage with it with your own people, and let's grow the conversation. So, just to sort of like clear the decks on this, I'm not somebody's social media channel. Like, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to provide some material for people to think about it if it makes sense for you to think about it. So, okay, so I'm going to start. This is actually, and some of this is super complicated. Even like for me, I was just like, because I'm not really actually good in the abstract. I'm pretty materialistic when it comes right down to it. So I'm really trying really hard to work in abstraction. And I never even took a physics class in college, which in some respects is probably good because I didn't learn it wrong. Like, I'm just open. And I think for many of us, people are afraid to wade into these spaces because they don't know all the things. And I'm like, actually, you're probably better off not knowing all of the things, because then you can learn it in your own mind, how you think about it, and not just internalize how other people are thinking about it and telling you the right way and the wrong way. So, this is a section about space. And essentially what he was talking about in the beginning was space in physics traditionally is individuation, this idea that we are separate as opposed to all interconnected. And I think he's of a mind that we are all interconnected. But the idea in and of itself of space is that there is an other, there's something else out there. And that's mathematical, that's counting, because you have to, in order to have there be an other, you have to be able to count that there's you and then there's something else out there, and that's a counting mechanism. And so the first chapters were about counting, and it got really abstract, like counting, like measuring a table with elephants and some stuff like that, which was really like, oh, like in units of measurement. But then this section is about space. But space, again, goes back to counting because it's about individuation. And is that actually the thing that we should be dealing with, is individuation? Or are we more embedded in the universe and the cosmology? So this is called Space a la Mode. And this is a subchapter of Space to Let. And it's page 57 of this book. We tend to think of space as rigid, fixed, and eternal. But our experience of space varies with circumstances and history. Earlier, people did not see and feel space as we do. Now, I think this is also important. He's going to get into this later about language and how language shapes the way we conceive of the world. And I think in many respects, that's probably why the American Philosophical Society, next to Independence Hall, not only has the history of science, but also a whole section on indigenous language, because they're very interested in alternative ways of thinking about things from a different cosmology. And that's very, very powerful. And that is done through language and structures of language and how it's built, how you build your consciousness out, and then you project it into the world through language. And so it's not rigid, and people have had different ideas about how reality presents. Immanuel Kant said that space, time, and causality are conceptual and intuitive categories constructed by the human mind in response to matter. So, like, we're sort of in the driver's seat on this. They are categories for organizing our sense perceptions and experiences. And that's really important to think about, organizing our sense perceptions, because right now, so much of what we're getting is through digital space, including this thing, right? Like, I'm not outside of this thing. So how to organize it, how to curate it, because we're saturated with a fire hose of information. And then what does it mean? Making sense out of the information you have. They are neither purely of the mind nor of the world, but a product of their interplay. And without the concepts of space, time, etc., the amount and complexity of the sense data we receive constantly through our eyes and ears would create an incoherent and confusing tangle of stimuli and mental images. And I think that's really interesting if you think about, like people on the spectrum and sensory, like some of the sensory over, like they're maybe their operating system is at a different level than ours, and so the way in which they process the sensations is different than I would, although I'm probably a little bit on the spectrum too. So, but that not everybody has the same way of sensory processing. Okay. Space, with its dimensionality, extension, and depth, provides room in which things may spread out and become separate from each other. So that's the separation. It offers a structure for sorting out the bewildering impressions. It brings order out of chaos. And so I think by like zooming out some, space gives you a chance to like have separate things out and make sense of them and see the patterns. And I think that's some of what I do when I make these maps is I create a digital space. It's like a digital whiteboard. Do the sources of our sense impressions have an independent reality? Kant does not finally answer this question. He does imply the existence of an external reality. He refers to, quote, things in themselves, which are the ultimate but fundamentally unknowable sources of our perceptions. All we can ever know through our powers of observation and reasoning concerns the nature and behavior of these perceptions, and not of the things of themselves, from which they are presumably derived. And so this is all sort of secondhand knowledge. I mean, that's this idea of secondhand knowledge. And thus, the intellect can never be a source of information about the ultimate matter of reality, if any. And this has largely been the position of science, which seems too busy with what the intellect can do to be bothered about what it presumably cannot. My own viewpoint is somewhat different. I do not draw any sharp distinction between some ultimate entity and our perception of it. And thus, I cannot talk about our mental constructs as simply a response to some independent, albeit unknowable reality. I think of a whole continuum from construct to object as human creation, although not a capricious one. And what I take as ultimate experiences are more psychological than physical. And I shall develop this theme later. So, psychology over the material reality. But for now, I must observe that the main problem is the framework in which this dilemma is conceived. Now, if one begins by assuming a separation of subject and object, or of mind and body, the boundary between them sooner or later becomes problematical. And as such, separations are so fundamental to our thinking that it is difficult to conceive of alternatives. Indeed, it is the very notion of separation and articulation that is at the root of our spatial metaphor. So it's the other, the core thing of the other. When we picture space today, we tend to visualize an empty world, void and without qualities. It has the fundamental property of extension from which we derive our ideas, not only of the quantity and measurability of space, but also of its capacity to be filled or occupied. It also has a characteristic continuity and dimensionality. But none of this adds up to anything very substantial. Space is just about the most vacuous concept we have. We conceive it as the absence of everything, nothing but pure extension, the capacity or potentiality to be occupied by matter, yet not itself matter. And if we look at one of the marvelous perspective drawings, say of Da Vinci, which seems to capture so perfectly the character of a three-dimensional reality on a sheer two-dimensional surface, we immediately comprehend the laws of perspective which the artist so deftly employs. If we reflect on such matters, we are delighted that these laws were discovered in the Renaissance and amazed that artists should have struggled for so many years prior to that to portray space property on flat planes. It seems incredible that the simple and obvious geometrical constructions, which we call laws of perspective, should have escaped artists for so long. And medieval and pre-medieval painting will always appear quaint and naive to us, at least in its representation of space. It is difficult for us to conceive of space other than an empty void to which the laws of perspective can be applied, And this has led us to believe that there is something objective or absolute about our spatial notions. But the preeminence of our own view is not so difficult to challenge if we look at the art forms, belief patterns, and languages of societies remote from ours in time, place, or experience. For example, to the mind of medieval people, space did not have the cold, empty geometric character that it has for us. We experience ourselves as isolated, disconnected entities in a vast, empty void. But the medieval people felt more a part of their surrounding environment. They felt a kind of extrasensory but conscious connection to the plants and animals around them, to the heavenly objects, to the very elements and minerals of the earth itself. We tend to dismiss such experiences as primitive or misguided, and we explain them away as examples of animism and anthropomorphism. Or we reject them along with the gibberish of astrology and alchemy, which have been discredited by modern science. But at the moment, we are challenging the assumptions of modern science and may not use them to reject other belief structures. We are obliged to take more seriously the notions of other civilizations, the sensing of human character and life in so-called inanimate objects by many quote unquote primitive and even pre-Renaissance peoples should not be viewed as some kind of magical network of relationships existing within space as we know it today. Rather, it is part of the actual experience of space for these people. Suppose I, as a medieval man, diagnose myself as mercurial, and I symbolize this through a felt connection to the planet Mercury, or the element quicksilver in the Earth's crust. And within the framework of my medieval mind, I do not picture all of this to myself as some mysterious influence of the planet Mercury acting at a distance across vast reaches of empty space, or as some alchemical spell that Quicksilver casts over my personality, regardless of its distance and separation from me in the earth. These are not relationships in space to me, they are space. It is the sum of all the felt organic connections between my inner and outer worlds that I experience as space itself. Space is the synthesis of all of my feelings of relatedness, connectivity, orientation. Owen Barefield summarized it beautifully. The background picture then, parentheses in the Middle Ages, was of man as a microcosm within the macrocosm. And I think that's very much about the fractals. It is clear that he did not feel himself isolated by his skin from the world outside him to quite the same extent as we do. He was integrated or mortised into it, each different part of him being united to a different part of it by some invisible thread. And in his relation to his environment, the man of the Middle Ages was rather less like an island and rather more like an embryo than we are. And so to me, like that feels like that Voronoi crystal that they might want us imagining the essence of natural life is existing in some cube, blockchain mindfile cube, as a crystalline structure that's like rotating in some empty vacuous space, but we're not. Like we could choose a different story. And it's nice to have a reminder that there are other people in other slices of this time that felt differently about the world and the universe and our place in it. And it's interesting to me that the UNESCO, man and his environment, man in the biosphere, it's embedded within. And so it seems to me sort of a hat tip to that. But even such notions as relationship and environment conceal from us the more remote and unfamiliar wellspring of our modern spatial metaphor. A clue to the more organic view of space of so-called primitive societies may be gotten from the notion of the totem. Nowadays, we view animals and objects as different, distinct, and separate from us, and so we find it hard to imagine or feel any kind of relation to them. And at an earlier period, a person's relation to the totem was through ancestry or kinship. And such a blood relationship was felt inwardly as a kind of participation and accepted as part of life and experience. In the very earliest times, the totem relationship was of identity. No separation was felt between oneself and the totem, and the original totem experience or relation seems to have evolved from identity to participation to separation. If we look upon present attitudes about animals and objects as distinct from and unrelated to us and a kind of negative totemism. And I do think about all of the social distancing, all of the breakdown and the separation, and even the freedom and liberation narrative that is like you and you're by yourself and you're not connected in these webs of relationship. And the fact that the web of relationship, I think, is going to seek to supplant these natural energetic connections with like invisible networks of smart contract layers, right, that are acting on us. If you have these two versions, you have a biodynamic, photonic, organic part of a time continuum, you, and then you have you in the little box with the polyhedra crystals being pulled on by strings of the smart contracts. Like there's these two different versions, and we still have, because we're constructing reality in our minds, the chance to imagine the other story. Okay. All of this hints at a totally different experience of space from our own. These relationships of kinship, participation, and identity cannot be viewed as bridging the gaps of space. They are space. They must not be interpreted as geometrical and physical, but as organic, psychological, mythic, symbolic, and metaphorical. The Renaissance artist did not discover properties of space which had always been there for all to see. He began to construct and experience a new kind of space. He was far more an inventor than a discoverer. So that's somebody that's like building a story to inhabit. So they built a story in which two-dimensional space could be remade as three-dimensional space. And I feel like that's the moment we're entering now, is sort of like the metaverse equivalent of that, right? We can take 3 dimensions and turn it into 2 dimensions, right? Like we can take the real 4th dimensional multiverse reality and then push it into a digital format. We can take atoms and we can turn them into bits, and then when there is bits, we can manipulate them a lot better. Not us, but these I've been calling them digital conquistadors lately. So our modern notion of space is a compound metaphor that embodies all our concepts and experiences of separation, distinction, articulation, isolation, delimitation, division, differentiation, and identity. Fundamental to all of these is the idea of distance, for one cannot distinguish and identify overlapping things. Now think about that. Think about all of the social distancing, right? It can't distinguish overlapping things, so it has to separate things out and become distant and separate, so that it's more easily computable and identifiable. Sorry about that. I lost my place. Distance, that they can't overlap. So a most fundamental and universal property of space, embodied or implied in all physical law, is that two things cannot occupy the same place at the same time. This impenetrability of the point and the idea of extension are the essence of our spatial metaphor. The laws of perspective and geometry for us are a codified summary of our normal experience of alienation, unique identity, and unrelatedness. It has all been abstracted, externalized, and synthesized into a cold, empty void we call space. But it is all our doing and the result of idolizing our creation. And yet we continue to believe that space is simply there, independent of us. And so it always was and always will remain. And it's a good reminder that our idea of space changes over time. And it's being changed again. The metaphor of space is that our modern mechanism for avoiding the horrendous experience of oneness, of the chaos, of the ultimate state of unity to which the mystic seers and philosophers of all ages have referred. We fear that state and picture it as one of undifferentiated dissolution and non-identity. It seems to be the antithesis of space, with its extension, articulation, and impenetrability. Our very fears are felt in spatial terms as we imagine being swallowed up, dissolved, and blended with all the other things in some primal uniform glob. We cannot even conceive of these cataclysmic processes except as occurring in space and time. Such is the pervasive and ingrained nature of our spatial metaphor, which we have long idolized and believed to be without alternatives. So everything is grounded in space. It might be objected that the geometry was discovered long before the Renaissance and the Enlightenment by the ancient Egyptians and Greeks, and that its techniques were applied to a distinctly spatial conception of the motion of heavenly objects, if not to painting. And to answer this, one must turn to historians and philosophers of science, beginning with Plato, to understand the role played by pre-modern geometrical models in, quote, saving appearances of the phenomena. Geometry in its application to astronomy was used by the ancient Greeks and roughly until the time of Copernicus to reconcile the outward appearances of events and phenomena with their inner concealed true meaning. The irregular and chaotic external appearance of things was to be saved or reconciled with their inner harmony and order by means of an intermediate geometrical model or a hypothesis. These hypotheses to save the appearances were frankly recognized as useful representations, not as truthful descriptions of reality. And all of this was changed by the Copernican revolution, which stands as a major turning point in the evolution of the notion of a hypothesis and the Western view of reality. Since the time of Copernicus and Bacon, any collection of mathematical and geometrical statements capable of saving all the appearances of the phenomena have been given the status of physical law, accurate statements about reality and not merely hypotheses. It was for this reason that Newton made his famous disclaimer, quote, "I do not construct hypotheses," parentheses, although the modern connotation of hypothesis as a tentative postulate subject to experimental verification has blurred Newton's intended meaning. Thus, the development of geometry and its use as a construct or hypothesis prior to the modern era does not reveal to us how earlier peoples pictured and experienced space. It is likely, in fact, that it took humans 2,000 years to begin taking seriously their geometrical models, to treat a representation as something physical. So that's really important. That is really important. The idea that it took humans 2,000 years to begin taking seriously geometrical models to treat a representation as something physical. And I would say that's where we're at now. That's what happened under the lockdowns, was that it was all run on a computer simulation with the metaverse running the real world. The representation, the mathematical representation of biocomputation took precedence over the real, the physical, the material. So yesterday's metaphor is today's reality. Modern space is a recent invention. There is another aspect of our modern spatial metaphor worth considering for the light it can shed on our earlier discussion about counting. In chapter 1, the counting operation in the process of measuring length was traced back to the ability to articulate and identify the discrete elements of a set. And we saw that an essential step in determining the length of a table was to make a one-to-one correspondence between the unit length segments laid out along the edge of the table and the members of some discrete set, such as elephants or simply geometrical points. And this in turn was seen to depend on the human ability to articulate, recognize, and identify the elements of the set. It now becomes clear that the notions of separation, discreteness, and articulation, so essential to counting and in turn to measurements, are among the fundamental characteristics of space as we conceive it. We cannot even count without something like our spatial metaphor. Thus, our constructed space has precisely the properties needed in order to measure it. And again, we can see the built-in circularity and self-consistency of our metaphor of reality. So the separation. Identification or singling out, parentheses, a fine spatial metaphor if ever there was one, presupposes an extended background of differentiable things, objects, points, what have you, that can be separated from each other. And this is part of the design of our spatial metaphor. It spreads out and disentangles the otherwise continuous, chaotic experience of what may well be a supraspatial or non-spatial world. The delimitation of objects and in their isolation from one another is a created construct of the human mind, at the very least, a necessary consequence of its peculiar method of sorting and filtering sense data. A la Kant, our ideas of extension and divisibility are synonymous with our conception and experience of space. Space means extension, distance, apartness, isolation. And all of these characteristics are mental constructs, along with the idea of a distinct object and even of number itself. Space, measurement, and number are consequences of our fear of chaos. So I'm going to keep going with this, but I'm just going to take a quick break. oh gosh, this goes on for a bit, but I think I mean, I don't know if you guys are hanging, but that's really, I mean, this goes along with the holographic reality book, the Talbot book, the idea of like the language and our concept frame how we see things, how we do that. And but there are other ways, and there have been other ways for far longer than what we're doing with computation and these simulacra that are developed. So part of the article that I'm hoping to put out this weekend, it talks about being able to see the labyrinth. Like, can you see the simulation? Can you actually see it? And if you could see it, like within the idea of Theseus and the labyrinth and the Minotaur, like the Ariadne's thread is on the floor, like the red thread, and you could, if you could conceptualize that you are in a labyrinth, then once you can see it, you could also see the thread and you could find your way out. And, you know, Jason was doing some proofreading on it for me. And he's like, yeah, like those stone labyrinths were really, they're just rocks. They're just meditative walks into a center. And, you know, I encountered several of those when I was on the trip to Virginia, and you could just step over, like you didn't have to walk to the middle. You could just like literally sort of decide to just cross and just get up and walk across the stones and get out, because they're not tall. They're just like 8 inches tall. You could get out. But you actually have to understand what you're in. And that's what I'm trying to, that's the thing that I'm interested in exploring right now, is what is this thing that we are in, and how did they conceptualize it? And then how can we reconceptualize it? Because we're not limited to what the space that they're occupying. So this next section, it's called Astrological Space. Now remember, this guy is an associate professor of physics, or was at least, at the University of Minnesota. So he actually is a physicist. This isn't by somebody who's anti-physics. He's just saying that we don't fully understand it. Okay, astrological space. A very powerful spatial metaphor alternative to our own may be discovered through a sympathetic consideration of astrology. Now, remember, a lot of this stuff with cycles from the Edward Dewey, the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, is what he was finding were that these cycles at various different intervals were affected by the sun, by solar cycles. So it really were these financial markets that were affected by planetary alignment, which was sort of like astrology, but nobody wanted to actually call it astrology. They wanted to come up with another term for it. Okay, so the unity and connectedness of all things is reflected in the astrological blending and equating of the inner and outer realms of consciousness and space. Astrology holds up a mirror to human consciousness. It reflects the medieval feeling of being embedded in the cosmos. Now, and I think this whole thing about the Middle Ages, and that maybe it was actually a kinder or gentler world, that was like a rich universe that you were occupying rather than something cold and clinical and primitive. Like, that's kind of fascinating. Like, I'd never really thought about the Middle Ages that way. And I mean, sure, like, not to gloss over that, like, life was really difficult for most people, but it's quite interesting. Okay. So astrology holds up a mirror to human consciousness. It reflects the medieval feeling of being embedded in the cosmos. If we try to understand astrology sympathetically from within the Greek and medieval forms of consciousness that nurtured it, we find that the underlying tenet of astrology, quote, as above, so below, unquote, is decidedly inconsistent with the conception of an inner subjective world of mind and an outer subjective objective one of reality, which is usually assumed as a matter of course today. Our idea of above and below, or outer and inner, is that of two different spatial realms. For the medieval astrologer, above and below refer not to different places, but different aspects of the same thing. There can be no above without a below. The two are connected, in fact, unified, and many correspondences and felt relationships between them inform the study of astrology. Astrology is thus the explication of the connections that exist between the stars and humans, between two apparently different realms, which are actually one. Since the experience of this unity is not ordinarily given to us, we find correspondences, echoes, hints of one realm in the other. And in using the stars to study ourselves, we tacitly accept this unity and find our inner selves reflected in our experience of the world and its space. Medieval consciousness did not feel so keenly as does ours that the mind and the rest of the organic space of the human body is bounded by our skin. We feel ourselves to be well defined and delimited from everything outside ourselves. What is inside me, and what is outside is other, and there's nothing in between and no overlap. If I think about it, there is some ambiguity when I eat. Some of my intake remains foreign and is expelled, and the rest turns into me. I might have some trouble determining the exact instant that the foreign substance becomes me, but at some point it is my living tissue which I can use to feel with or pump blood with or think with. And when I conceptualize about my body in this way, it's almost as if my body isn't me either. I seem to be an agent using my body, which therefore becomes somehow other. And this gradual diminishing of the me is a characteristic feature of modern consciousness and space. As I think about myself in terms of the physical, chemical, and biological processes, which science has been so successful in describing, I picture my consciousness or myself as occupying a shrinking region somewhere inside my head. At least that's where I seem to feel it. Where does that leave me and my inner space? Indeed, without the revolution in mind expansion of the 1960s and 1970s, the crushing weight of the arguments of modern science might well have convinced us by now that we don't exist at all, and that only what is other is real, and that consciousness and even life itself are ephemeral and illusory. Astrological or medieval space, by contrast, has none of the abstract, lifeless character. It would not even have a purely spatial character were we to experience it. Much of what a medieval person would think of as spatial today we would call mental, emotional, or psychological. To the medieval mind, space, or let us say spatial relationships, comprises the felt connections among things. If a night was called quixotic or mercurial, well, this was as much a spatial as well as a psychological statement, to use modern categories. The night and the element were two different aspects of the same thing, which were connected in some way that was dimly perceived by the medieval mind as space. There was no separate external geometrical space in which to picture abstract relationships. Rather, there existed among all things a web of organic and reflexive relationships whose quality for the medieval mind was analogous to our sense of space. And I think that's really amazing. I'm just going to say that again. There was no separate external geometrical space in which to picture abstract relationship. Rather, there existed among things a web of organic and reflexive relationships whose quality for the medieval mind was analogous to our sense of space. And that's quite beautiful, I think. It's a much richer picture than that we live in a Voronoi crystalline twistable cube. In such a realm of organic connectedness, the medieval astrologer pondered the relationship of humans to the stars. He did not think in terms that we might of the influence of the planet Mercury on someone at the moment of his or her birth, projected across millions of miles of empty space. Rather, he recognized in the primal moment when a newborn child drew its first breath of life, the stamp of a unique event impressed upon the whole cosmos and reflected in every rhythm and pattern. He might equally well have read the child's essence and potential in other reflective and synonymous patterns, in the waves and currents of the sea, or in the fluttering leaves in the forests, or the elements of the earth, or the stars in the sky. Astrology does not concern itself, therefore, with cause and effect. It makes no more sense to say that Mercury has cast a spell on the newborn baby than it does to say that the baby has cast one on Mercury. It isn't that either one affects the other, but that they reflect each other. The whole configuration of earth and sky is a profound symbol for the child and for Mercury's momentary harmonies and relations to other heavenly bodies. In this important sense, astrology is antithetical to modern thought and science, which tend to suggest that the cosmos and its causal connections are without meaning or purpose. Our modern meaningless random universe would be inconceivable to the medieval astrologer. Meaning and wisdom are incorporated in astrological space, which is symbolic, organic, and synchronistic, rather than empty, geometrical, and causal. The spatial relationship of Mercury to the child, in our modern sense of space, is of little importance in medieval astrology. A natal chart represents the organic and harmonic relations among the various astrological elements rather than the geometrical ones. It is the organic, reflective, symbolic relation that is of primary importance, and this connection is felt intuitively by the astrologer as it was by ordinary people in the Middle Ages. And I think these connections and the way in which things are embedded and meshed and they speak to one another and are visible and encoded with meaning, being able to unravel the meaning, that's something that I've been learning more from Steffers. And I think the power structures are really aware of this because they do embed it in our media, which is another three-dimensional representation of two-dimensional space, these ideas that are encoded within digital media, both print digital media and video and story, that they encode the stories with the sentiment that they want you to take away. But it's not necessarily, there's stuff on the surface, but then there's stuff at deeper and deeper layers that they're aware of. And so it's interesting to think of like the richness of the landscape, both the actual material landscape and how you resonate with that, and then the simulacra landscape that's created in the within space that is increasingly taking over a lot of real estate in our heads. The medieval person felt connected to Mercury in much the same way that as you feel connected, let's say, to your liver. The geometrical location of your liver scarcely begins to suggest its basic relationship to you. It is your liver's organic and functional relation to you that is important. It purifies your blood, it aids your digestion, it stores some of your energy, and in turn, it is nourished symbiotically by the organs and symptoms of your body, which it serves. And all of this happens in a smooth and functional way, which cannot possibly be described adequately in spatial terms. Your liver functions holistically and purposefully in concert with the rest of your body. You are an integral whole. Your liver is not really separable from you, spatially or in any other way. And if someone tried to convince you that your liver is really somewhere far out in space and that it carries out its functions by mysteriously raying its products to you across the empty miles, your incredulous reaction would not be very different from that of a 15th century astrologer who had just been told that the planet Mercury is located millions of miles away in space and not organically connected to him, nor in any way a part of him. Now, this is quite lovely. This book has all of these illustrations. I'm not really good at seeing this, but you can see, I guess that's the liver. That's the medieval guy in the liver in the machine. So there's some really lovely illustrations in this thing. It's very telling. Okay, so the liver. He's got a liver. And Mercury, it's all connected. The modern distinctions between the symbolic and realistic, metaphorical and literal, inner and outer, subjective and objective, have little meaning for medieval consciousness. To medieval astrologers, alchemists, and artists seeking the unity of all consciousness, life, and being, what possible sense could there be to a space that is abstract, external, and perspectival? They knew that space was a metaphor and a symbol for all the inner relationships and harmonies among the stars, the elements, and humans. In modern consciousness, mathematical laws of cause and effect in geometrical space are the emasculated vestiges of the connections we share with all things, vividly sensed by earlier consciousness. So I'm going to just read that again because that's pretty amazing. To medieval astrologers, alchemists, and artists seeking the unity of all consciousness, life, and being, what possible sense could there be to a space that is abstract, external, and perspectival? They knew that the harmonies among the stars, the elements, and humans, they knew that space was a metaphor, a symbol for all the interrelationships and harmonies among the stars, the elements, and humans. In modern consciousness, mathematical laws of cause and effect in geometrical space are the emasculated vestiges of the connections we share with all things, vividly sensed by earlier consciousness. I'm just going to pause here for a second because I'm going to do another site visit, assuming my car holds together, on Tuesday. And I'm meeting someone up in the New Jersey, New York state border. And we had originally meant to go to Loomis Labs in Tuxedo Park, but then we found out that there's a 24/7 gatehouse guard, and that, like, I guess it's still super rich estates and you're only allowed to go in if you live there or if you have a guest pass, which wouldn't be us. So I think we're going to bail on Loomis Labs, but there's a sort of a sacred rock near the Ramapo, Lenape lands in Suffern. And then there's this whole campus that's Columbia University's campus around climate science and biogeoengineering and all this stuff. And it dates to 1948. And the guy, it says an estate on the Palisades that was owned by the man who was the chairman of the board of JP Morgan. And his wife was a alumna of Columbia. So after she died, she gave their summer estate to the university and they turned it into like the climate science campus. And so we're going to do some things. I'm going to like hit up some signals intelligence, but there's a signals intelligence museum further down in New Jersey that I'm going to get the next day. But I'm gathering things to set some intentions while I'm out there because, gosh, New Jersey is full of these signals and communications, right? This enmeshed history. And that's why I guess in some ways I'm really like, I'm called to do this particular thing because my skill set is cultural landscape and like decoding some of these stories and in art history. But so I went to the garden, Bartram's garden yesterday and gathered some things. I have my basket and the tide was really low on the mud flats, which was great because it had been raining for like 4 or 5 days. So I thought the water would be high, but it was actually very far out, and I was able to gather like beautiful stone beautiful round gray pebbles and some pink quartz hearts, and not too many crabs today, but different kinds of pods, some beautiful, amazing milkweed pods that just like when they burst open are like the shape of a heart. And then in it is the fluff, with the little brown seed heads that when they kind of fluff out. But this one, it had opened perfectly. And then it was still, the pods were right in the middle and the brown of the seeds and the white of the fluff. And it was still all like beautifully contained. And I said, oh, it looks like angel wings. I sent to my friend Cliff. I'm like, look, this looks like angel wings in this pod. And look, it's in a heart, like a boat. And he's like, yeah, well, that's like angels come through nature to, keep us company on this journey. Right. And so I'm taking these pods, but I just want to sort of say, because someone asked me on one of my videos, like, how do you do this? And I'm like, you go, like, I don't know, like literally this idea of the dandelion came to me, in the spring of 2020 or whatever, that maybe the answer was in dandelion somehow. And that's communication. Like that's communication with source, with life, with this connected relationality that is not on the blockchain, that is not contained in the Voronoi, polyhedra crystal. It is actually tapping into that line of communication because it's like jamming all of our signals. So I would just encourage people, like if you're interested in like making some of these intentions, like to me, it's like a communication portal. And what Cliff was saying is like, it's essentially you're finding a place in the world that needs attention from life itself, the power of life itself to come and make a rebalance, right? And these hearts that are made of these natural materials can be that. And so anyway, I just gathered all of these things, and I'm just saying, if you too have thought like, how do you do this? Like there's no rule, like there's no guidebook. No one told me how to do it. I just went out into the world and see what the world has to say back to me, like what is there in the world for me. And it is these gifts. And that's part of one of the conversations we were having on the discourse was about gifts of life to itself, because we are embedded in life. Like we are that, we have that by our birthright communication with that which is fully beyond us. Right. And so anyway, I just wanted to interrupt that and sort of say that, because I feel like these communications are always getting jammed, always getting messed up, and always being challenged. But the resonance in our own hearts, in our own guts, and our own solar plexus and our pineal gland, like all of that is to this beautiful creation, which is kind of what's being talked about here. And we lost it, like we were domesticated out of it, I think. But that doesn't mean that we can't renew it and strengthen it. In some ways, I feel like it's like when people have, neurological damage or a stroke, and that through practice, you can re-strengthen those ties. You open the communication, you attempt to open a communication, and then you work at it. And so anyway, to me, this really resonates. Just looking. I'm sorry. Okay, sensed by earlier consciousness. Since there is no way to separate our knowledge of the world from our consciousness of it, changes in either world or mind must be understood as changes in both. World and mind are seemingly different, perhaps complementary aspects of the same thing, and thus a different view of the world held by earlier peoples, one to us is simpler and more naive than our own, is not a reflection of inferior knowledge, but of a different metaphoric expression of the world resulting from a different state of consciousness. The evolution of consciousness then follows from the inseparability of mind and matter and from the recognition that other people have experienced the world differently from ourselves. This requires that we accept a quote unquote primitive view as a serious, sympathetic, and accurate description of an earlier experience rather than an uninformed, superstitious, or inferior one. If experience has changed and if consciousness is inseparable from reality, then there has been an evolution of consciousness and reality. So that I think that's a really important takeaway. In modern times, our lost sense of synthesis or connection has become intellectualized as an assumption about reality, that it is separate and independent of our inner mental world, and in fact subsumes that inner world, which is therefore not real. We conceive of space as an infinite, empty, lifeless, cold, dark, alien, and void. It is the blank, unfeeling stage on which matter plays out its aimless, random acts. It provides the merest, tiniest corner in which to harbor an insignificant speck of a planet, warmed by a second rate star on which, by sheer accident against impossible odds, life and finally consciousness have come to be. We see ourselves as living in a basically alien universe, which offers us little succor or hope, and above all, no meaning or purpose. And that's pretty bleak. But that doesn't have to be it. We've been conditioned to this. And I would say, like, as we make our reality through our mind and how we engage our senses, like the digital realm is super influential in that space. And if you think back to, in the years up and before the lockdowns, all of the focus on fake news and content curation, these people, these digital conquistadors, these like alchemical consciousness manipulators, they know that like in that space, they can be very sneaky if we're not in touch with our inner self. Like if we're not in touch with life itself, we can get lost. We can wander off this path and then we can start to bow down to authorities. And, I think part of, what we've been navigating within austerity is that, we're competitive, right? And we want to know the rules. Like, okay, so if there's not enough, and in order to have a safe or stable or fulfilling life, we have to follow all the rules and we have to be the one to scramble to the top. And then we need to know what the rules are. And then we need to listen to the experts. And then like it's the culture of meritocracy and expertism and all of that. And then we lose our inner voice. Like we lose that part because we're like, okay, who's in charge? Who's the influencer? What is the rubric? Which hoops am I jumping? Like if I do this, is it going to be okay? Like if I do that, is my family going to be okay? And like I just need to know like what actually is reality. And you're looking for it outside rather than inside, and understanding that the inside, what is inside you actually affects what is outside, because we're making the reality through our mental construct. So anyway, I think that's pretty interesting. But yeah, let's not be in the cold, alien, dark world. Like let's be in a rich, amazing world, because we could choose that too. Okay, so our modern space is the perfect metaphor for separation, extension, individuation, and alienation. And I think alienation is a key word here. We cannot even conceive of existence except in space, which then becomes the medium par excellence of existence. To exist is derived from the Latin word meaning to stand out, and space is exactly what we stand out from. Space is the background from which we emerge or exist, in which we become an articulate, individuated, unique being. On the one side of the coin is existence and uniqueness, and on the other, alienation and isolation. Our spatial metaphor is thus intimately linked with our fears and apprehensions about life, death, and survival. The space of medieval consciousness, by contrast, is organic, connective, nurturing, human, intelligent, alive with meaning. It is a realm of wisdom and a storehouse of knowledge. Rather than space, it is a place, home, environment. Like a womb to an embryo, it sustains, warms, and nurtures. It provides balms and lifelines. It has no clear cut boundaries and no separation between inner and outer. Although less sharply defined, clean, and geometrical than our space, it contains things that we would not think of as spatial at all. Things psychological, emotional, intuitive. One's feelings for others and other living and inanimate things are included. So that sense of medieval space incorporates love, appreciation, inspiration, belonging, kinship, and holiness. And I think that's really interesting. I never really thought about it like that, And you always think of the Middle Ages, and again, I'm sure it was no cakewalk. There was a lot of pretty tragic and traumatic stuff in the Middle Ages, but it's very interesting to imagine like the potentiality, the emergent potentiality, as opposed to like this stark backdrop of just grim clinical analysis that you're just marginalized and that you have no agency. Like in this, you're connected, but you have agency. Like I feel like we're pushed increasingly into a story where, freedom and liberty and agency means separate, that you're separate. And I'm like, I don't know. I think it's the richness of connectivity and support, that it is this dynamic of upholding each other that is part of that. In the medieval world, you felt somewhat less individual, but much more of a vital part of things. You belonged to some great organism and you functioned meaningfully and purposefully within it. The meaning and purpose might not be clear, that's true, but it was there all around you. You could feel it and sense it. Astrologers and alchemists sought it in the stars and the elements, whose connections to you were not in space, but were space. You were basically at home, supported and succored. Life might be difficult, but never foreign. Death might be frightening, but not annihilating. And I think that's an important idea too. You were basically at home, supported and succored. Life might be difficult, but never foreign. Death might be frightening, but not annihilating. We dismiss astrology not so much for the reason that it does or does not work, but because of the anomalous kinds of explanations it will require of our current physical and geometrical theories. The latest paradigm, as Kuhn would say. Carl Jung uses the notion of synchronicity to provide some kind of explanation for the divinatory powers of the ancient I Ching and of astrology. Synchronicity is the principle of non-causal links between coincident or symbolically related events. An example would be the cardinal I sighted outside my window while writing the paragraph on cardinality. Another is the correspondence between a prominent position of the planet Mercury and the birth of a child with dominant mercurial traits. Synchronicity is no explanation at all in the accepted scientific sense, for an acausal principle is a contradiction in scientific terms. But rather than reject synchronicity for this reason, we must recognize its power to help us transcend our limitations. The real contradiction lies in the incompatibility of synchronous and causal consciousness, or of astrological and physical space. And the incompatibility stems from our refusal to apprehend and accept the relative metaphorical status of all of our constructs. As long as we insist that one kind of space is literal and objective, while another is metaphorical and mythic, we shall always be bound by the apparent contradictions between them. For these different views are complementary, and neither of them can give a complete picture. Human enlightenment is probably the result of the rare synthesis of all the many views, metaphors, constructs, and can never be completely experienced, understood, or communicated in terms of any one of them. To the extent that astrology is already a partial synthesis of some of our most meaningful metaphors, we do ourselves a grave injustice to ignore its wisdom. Indeed, we do ourselves much harm in refusing to seriously study and contemplate many of the mythic and symbolic systems of early primitive and alternative cultures. Our chronic inability to come to grips with such matters as totemism, animism, reincarnation, extrasensory perception, divination, and a world of mythic creatures, archetypes, and gods and goddesses with human traits stems from our idolatry of physical and geometrical space. I'm just going to say that one again. This is really kind of cool. Indeed, we do ourselves much harm in refusing to seriously study and contemplate many of the mythic and symbolic systems of early, primitive, and alternative cultures. Our chronic inability to come to grips with such matters as totemism, animism, reincarnation, extrasensory perception, divination, and a world of mythic creatures, archetypes, and gods and goddesses with human traits stems from our idolatry of physical and geometrical space. It is space which separates and distinguishes things from one another and then requires causality to link them again. Implicit in Jung's principle of synchronicity is the idea that all things are reflections of each other. Every pattern, every event is a microcosm of the whole universe. This holistic and fundamentally non-spatial notion has its roots in all ancient cultures. That all is derived from one, is buried deep in human consciousness. If I can read my personality in the stars, it is because I and the stars are one and the same, are but different metaphors. Before leaving the matters of astrology behind, there is one more metaphor I'd like to suggest with its help. The method of astrology provides for the construction of a natal chart for every human being. This chart is a symbolic map of the heavens at the time of the birth of the person, from which a gifted astrologer can read that person's basic character and destiny. It is not at all as fatalistic as it might sound, for astrology deals in potentialities and limitations, which define the broad outlines of events but do not determine them absolutely. And thus, each personality and its destiny is roughly correlated with a birth or natal star configuration and its subsequent unfolding pattern. In other words, the entire collection of human personalities and life stories is an alternate manifestation or metaphor of the evolving events of our solar system as viewed from the Earth, and all the complex occurrences and relationships of human life and society have their counterpart in the space-time events of astronomy. All human history is yet another space-time metaphor. And I'm kind of curious what you guys think about that in the comments. I think that's pretty interesting. And imagine, so, when they have the blockchain health records, right? They'll have everybody's birth particulars. Like these people will have the potentiality of checking everyone's natal charts, right? And understanding the parameters within which they operate as emergent energetic biophotonic beings in the harmonious relationships. And that's kind of wild if you think about it. I mean, beyond having your documentation of your epigenetic trauma and your, potential burden on society for impact finance deals, like having this other information that these people, the people at the highest levels are using metaphysics, alchemy, astronomy in this, and imagining the way in which like biocomputation, gamified biocomputation with synthetic biology and evolutionary economics and cyber physical environments, like those three things are going to mesh. Like what happens when like the baby is born and they actually, like these prediction markets, are the prediction markets going to take that into account? And are they going to nudge in certain ways and, either optimize or suppress people's pathways or their destinies? That's quite, these people have big telescopes. The Vatican's got really big telescopes in Arizona and other places. So it's a lot to think about. Okay, so I'm gonna just skip. No, I'm gonna read all of this. I have about 5 more pages to read, so I'm just gonna keep plowing through because I think this is all food for the brain. I don't know all of the stuff that I think about this at this point, but I trust Stephen Newcomb, and I'm finding this really interesting to apply to simulation modeling and how we step out of their labyrinth. Okay, Cartesian space. Another transformed metaphor for space is one we all learn about in high school. It is the analytical geometry of René Descartes. Nowadays, the brilliant legacy of Descartes is viewed with some misgiving. For as one of the founding fathers of the Enlightenment and the crucial mind-body dichotomy, he has bequeathed us a painfully sharp double-edged sword. His genius, which has cleanly cut through the dense web of primitive mystery, has also severed our felt connection to the universe. How ironic, then, that Descartes might have provided a means to reunite the rent parts. Analytical geometry is a correlation of algebra with geometry. Okay, so I think that this is how some of this foundation for the study of cycle stuff goes together. By means of a simple and elegant representation, the now famous graph grid with its perpendicular x and y axes, Descartes was able to show that any algebraic equation in two variables, x and y, for instance, is a precise description of a figure in a plane geometry. For example, a circle of radius r is given by the equation x squared plus y squared equals r squared. In this equation, x represents the distance along the x-axis, and similarly for y. And thus, any figure in two-dimensional plane geometry can be transformed into a mathematical or logical statement, and vice versa. Furthermore, the whole technique can be carried over into 3 dimensions by using algebraic equations in 3 variables. And clearly, algebra and geometry may be viewed as transformations of each other. And thus, a certain large collection of mathematical statements, those that describe all possible geometric figures, constitutes a perfect metaphor of space with all of its inherent geometrical properties. And this metaphor is expressed in logical and symbolic terms rather than in geometric ones. And so I do think that, like within the simulation, that they want to reduce us to some sort of mathematical coordinates, like dynamic mathematical coordinates, and make those predictions. I mean, I think that that's some of what I'm talking about in the piece that I'm going to put out this weekend, is about these derivatives traders and this idea that they are, on the one hand, that the crypto skeptics are setting up, it's like a straw man argument, although the harm is real, that like the harm of the sort of free market, crypto, anarcho-capitalist, libertarian, greed monsters doing Ponzi schemes and selling crap NFTs or whatever. Like, yeah, that's the story, but that's not the story that's supposed to carry through indefinitely. Like, there's going to be a transition phase where they're going to proffer you an option to shift, because, blockchain is just a tool. It's how you use it, right? Like, that's what they're always saying. It's just a tool. We can use it for good. And so the new version is going to be, well, we'll turn the world into a bunch of tokens that we exchange so the machine can track us. And I think the token exchange is part of the evolutionary economics and part of the mathematical calculation in the simulation modeling. And so the tokens are the token exchanges, the energetic token exchanges around the social contract, including interspecies social contracts, are really, really, really key moving forward. And it's about the modeling, about reducing the chaos of life into the order of tokenomics. So the idea that in the third dimension, which would be that Voronoi polyhedra, and then eventually we go into the fourth dimension, which is the one that's being deformed through various pressures and phase shifts through the fourth dimension of time. And that's the next piece. Let's see. Okay, so they want to represent the whole world as a mathematical simulation, and that's what I say. Like, yeah, that's what the metaverse is, right? It's a mathematical simulation. Okay, so we have here a metaphor for space in totally non-spatial terms. It is a linguistic version of space, and it is perfect, for there is no information about space which cannot be contained in its algebraic metaphor. No poet could ever accomplish such a feat, at least not in any normal state of consciousness. It would be tantamount to expecting of Shakespeare, words alone, a complete and perfect description of the man Hamlet. But to me, it feels reductive. I mean, that's sort of what it feels like to me. But and the logic board, that we will, like, living in the smart contract will be living in the logic, a sequence of logical circuits, of if-then statements. And so nothing that is illogical can happen. I mean, I guess that's what Star Trek was setting us up for all along. Thank you, Spock. It is true that algebra is not a natural medium of thought and communication for most people, but neither is Russian for most Americans or musical notation for most Eskimos. The point is that algebra is a form of language and logic which is treated very differently by the mind than spatial systems. Some people can deal more easily with logical concepts and others with geometrical ones. The talent for music or painting or language or mathematics may simply be the predilection for one particular space metaphor. It is entirely possible to view all systems of human thought and communication as fundamental metaphors of space, or inversely, to see space as a projected metaphor for the whole world of the human mind. Again, so space is about mind. And this idea is traceable to the texture and thought of Plato's philosophy, with its tendency, as Owen Barefield puts it, quote, to experience as one what we now distinguish absolutely as mind on the one hand and space on the other. Descartes' brilliant synthesis of algebra and geometry gives us a revealing glimpse, even through the screen of its formal mathematical structure, of the ghost of a former consciousness in which there was no separate inner and outer world, and the activities of the mind and of the moving objects in space were somehow experienced synonymously. It was a view of humans as, quote, surrounded by a cosmos or sphere of wisdom, rather than by empty space. Mind, thought, space, and motion were one and the same, and language reflected this amalgam. Okay, so, all right. So this next section is called the Tree of Man, and it's like 4 pages. And I'm going to start off by showing you this picture. So you can see there's a tree and it's cut. There's like a plane down here. Look, there's some Voronoi, there's some giraffes here and water, and there's a slice through it. So there's a slice through the tree that would make it in the plane look like disconnected, unrelated parts. But it is actually connected to the tree. But the people who are living in the 2D space cannot perceive it as thus. It looks just like a scattering of different things. So they're going to apply this idea of the tree of man for 2-dimensional people, not being able to conceptualize a 3rd dimension. They're taking it to the next level and saying, so what would it be like for us who live in 3 dimensions to not be able to conceptualize the 4th dimension of time? And so for us, there's an equivalency of trying to examine time the way a person living in a 2-dimensional plane would be able to not accurately interpret 3-dimensional space. So there's this cute. Okay. So let me go back here. The Tree of Man. And trees, I think, are very interesting. I mean, mythologically, you talk about archetypes, right? And I know Stephers has been doing, and Jen, like a lot into sort of the tree of life, and Ash and Asherah and Astarte and the mythic trees, Garden of Eden, right? Lots of trees, lots of tree talk. So by way of contemplating another transformed spatial metaphor, we shall consider some of the ideas of the philosopher, mystic, and mathematician P.D., the letter P, the letter D, Ouspensky, Ouspensky, P.D. Ouspensky. In his thought-provoking book, Tertium Organum, Ouspensky tries to help us think about and visualize things outside of our normal space-time perceptions. Okay, so this is a block quote. Let us imagine some object, say a book, outside of time and space. What will this last mean? Were we to take the book out of time and space, it would mean that all books which have existed, exist now, and will exist together. In other words, occupy one and the same place and exist simultaneously, forming, as it were, one book, which includes within it the properties, characteristics, and peculiarities of all books possible in the world. When we say simply a book, we have in mind something possessing the common characteristics of all books. This is a concept. But that book, about which we are talking now, possesses not only these common characteristics, but the individual characteristics of all separate books. What is, quote, man out of space and time? He is all humanity, man as the quote unquote species, Homo sapiens, but at the same time possessing all the characteristics, peculiarities, and individual earmarks of all separate men. This is you and I and Julius Caesar and all the conspirators who killed him and the newsboy I pass every day, and all the kings and all the slaves and all the saints and all the sinners, all taken together, fused into one indivisible thing of a man, like a great living tree in which are bark, wood, and dry twigs, green leaves, flowers, and fruit. Is it possible to conceive of and understand such a being by our reason? So that's a lot. I guess we're all connected. The attempt to visualize this marvelous conception of Ouspensky's will lead us into another space metaphor. So we begin with a clever visual conceptual device employed by Ouspensky and by many others, most notably Edwin A. Abbott in his book Flatland. This device has us try to picture higher dimensional worlds by beginning with those of lower dimensions. Okay, so to understand the fourth dimension and our difficulty in conceiving of it, Abbott writes about the imaginary adventures of a creature, a square, who lives in the two-dimensional plane of Flatland and who struggles to understand the world of three dimensions. Now, we must imagine this two-dimensional world as an exceedingly thin plane, for we cannot conceive of a physical existence of objects with no thickness at all. And in this world, our perceptions are severely limited. We see objects only on edge, as it were. We can sense only their periphery. For example, if we come across a circle, we can sense only its circumference, but not its inside area. And even this circumference would appear as a line, as would all objects. We should be unable to perceive directly the curvature of the circle or the shape of any object on the plane. This can be pictured clearly by viewing from the edge of a flat table, or imagining doing so, a number of paper cutouts of squares, circles, etc., lying flat on the tabletop. It is all quite analogous to the limitations on our perceptions in the world of three dimensions. We are able to see only projected surface areas of objects, not their interior volume. So I think that's really interesting. So, for me, everyone keeps saying, so now what? So what's the answer, Allison? We have to figure the things out. And I'm like, I don't know that we understand the game or the board. And I think there's actually potential in not knowing all the things, because I think it exists beyond our current stage of knowing. I mean, for most people. Now, there are people who are far more enlightened than me, just regular me, who know the things that exist in the beyond or spaces. But I find this really actually exciting, this idea that we don't know all of the things, or we forgot a lot of important things and we can go back and get them. So imagining the world as flat. So now imagine the sheer two-dimensional plane of our existence being pierced and intersected by a normal tree from the world of three dimensions. You might think of the plane as the surface of a body of water, covering about half of the tree. A good portion of the foliage rises above the water so that our plane is cut through by a complex pattern of leaves, blossoms, fruit, twigs, and branches. And all the parts of the tree that intersect our plane appear to us in cross-section as plane figures of irregular shape, whose peripheries alone we can see. And the entire cross-sectional array would seem like a collection of disconnected islands with no relationship among them. It would be almost impossible for us to realize that these clustered island barriers are in reality all interconnected in the third dimension, and farther, that they all participate in an incredibly complex system of mutual support and communication that characterizes a living organism. Okay, so I'm just gonna show the picture again. So it's all really connected, but we don't experience it as connected, and it's all supporting each other, but we don't appreciate that part of it. And I think that's what my friend Cliff was trying to tell me. It's like life is there. Like when he talks about his mentor who goes to the forest and talks to the plants and the flowers, and they're like, thank you for asking. We're actually here to help. Thank you for listening and engaging and opening up some communication and some dialogue. Is that maybe this is where we're at now? We think that there's this line, but there isn't. And I think that some people who maybe read this book, I'm not casting any blame on the author of this book, but maybe people who are familiar with these concepts understand the potentiality of natal charts and representing three-dimensional space as mathematical logic models in simulation things. And maybe in the story of their mind that they're just going to help God, the creator, nature out a little bit and optimize us from within our trajectory of our destiny, in our simulation model, right? And like, because we don't get that it's all connected. And somehow maybe the people who understand that it is all connected, they're the one trying to run the blockchain mine files, right? Like for our own good or to save us from planetary destruction or something like that. Now, I think that that's an abhorrent. And I don't think that that's something that we should be doing. But what I'm trying to move away from somewhat in my research, and this is something I'm just learning and practicing, is rather than casting blame, like identifying the wrongdoers and then assessing some penalty depending on how full of blame they are, is to imagine that like the vast majority of people in the world are trying to come out and like have a meaningful life, right? Like they're trying to like maybe detach from the vacant occupancy of unfeeling space-time and like kind of nestle into some sort of maybe more medieval world of connectivity, and have meaning and do good things and tell a good story with their life. But they don't understand the levels. They don't know the story that they're in, the levels of deception or communication failures that are happening. And so they're doing what they think are making good choices, but they have a very incomplete picture. And so I think maybe if what we can do is try to look inside, like knowing that we're all connected, right? So if we're hurting other people, we're actually ultimately hurting ourselves, is that internally, like if we can begin to wake up, then I think that we can, like with more openness maybe about what it is, and independently, not like everyone come over on Allison's space and do what I'm doing, but like in your own internal guidance, that we could find our way out. So anyway, back to the tree and the plain land and the three-dimensional land. So even harder for us to understand would be the relationship of each of these apparently isolated islands to the soil with its water and nutrients, all completely outside of our ken, or to the atmosphere and its weather, or to the distant sun. By analogy, now we may try to picture the collective humanity of which Ouspensky speaks as forming a single organism, a tree of man. We experience the various parts and members of this tree as if they were isolated individuals, each behaving like an independent agent with no apparent relationship or connection to the others. We see each person as an island in our three-dimensional world. We conceive of human relationship, interdependency, and community in terms of the somewhat abstracted and externalized notions of friendship, brotherhood, and love. These are things that somehow mysteriously bridge the gap of space between island individuals, but not which link them organically. We can hardly begin to imagine that, quote, all kings, all slaves, all saints, all sinners, all taken together are fused into one indivisible thing of a man like a great living tree. We cannot know of the fundamental unity of all people as a single complex organism in some higher dimensional world. We do not recognize our mutual dependency and support, nor our relationship to the nourishing surroundings. Do our fingers recognize their mutual connection? Do our blood cells know the vast organism they are part of? Do we experience our participation in humanity? All of this is by way of suggesting that our experience and our conception of the human race is yet another spatial metaphor. The vast array of human relationships through blood, race, society, religion, and politics is normally conceived of in familial, psychological, social, cultural, and historical terms. But we may equally well imagine it as a spatial network, as the multi-connected cell tissues, as organs of a great living organism. And Ouspensky's notion of our ordinary perception of the one, quote, man or, quote, tree in the seemingly variegated, separated, and isolated parts is further clarified by the human spatial metaphor. For as we saw earlier, the very essence of space is to provide for separation, articulation, and distinction. The spatialization of man is tantamount to the peopling of the world. And okay, I'm going to do the last 2 pages. So this one is called The Language of Space. And this one, let me see. Is this the part? No, later. Maybe I'll get to that later about the mole. And the only point of perception is your nose and you're the mole, and like what that is for time. I think that's the next chapter about time. So I might cover that a little bit later. The language of space. As a final comment in this discussion of spatial metaphor and the intuitive approach to space generally, I should like to briefly consider the unlikely matter of prepositions. That prepositions, as we use them in language, have a great deal to do with our intuitive notions about space is obvious as soon as we begin thinking about them. They are words used before nouns or adjectives, as the Random House Dictionary says, quote, that typically express a spatial, temporal, or other relationship, as in, on, by, to, since. Most prepositions have some spatial or temporal connotation. Inside the box, inside an hour, under the rock, under a minute, into, from, above, below, within, and so on. And many prepositions can be used either spatially or non-spatially. By the brook, by William Shakespeare, for this reason, for a mile, for an hour. But it is certainly significant that the same word serves both purposes. And does there not often remain some trace of a spatial flavor, even in the alternate uses, for example, in, quote, that book is for me, unquote. What relationship of the book to me does for express? Possession? Nearness? Acquisition? Is there not some implied motion toward me in the idea of intended for? Such spatial connotations may not be found in all the prepositional uses, but they do occur in many of them. Many of our concepts concerning distance, orientation, relative position, and motion in space are communicated and felt through prepositions, which thus seem to incorporate the peculiarities and idiosyncrasies of our spatial metaphor. Now, the other thing that always comes to mind when I think about prepositions is the statement, which was drummed into my head many times in the study of foreign languages, that the most idiomatic words in a foreign language, and therefore the most difficult to use, are the prepositions. Wilson Follett, in the article on prepositions in modern American usage, is unmistakable. This is a quote. One of the greatest difficulties in learning the European languages is the mastering of the idiomatic use of prepositions with verbs, adjectives, and nouns. A mastery of all the differences and subtleties is rare, yet nothing gives away the foreign speaker or the insensitive writer like the misused preposition, or again, the tenable preposition, which turns out to be wrong for the meaning intended. Why in French must we say en France, but à Paris? Or in German, bei mir ist alles klar, and yet komm sitz bei mir. These and countless other examples will occur to the language student. Just the idiomatic governance of the use cases of nouns in Latin, German, and Russian is enough to make anyone's head spin. And now what is peculiar and interesting in this is that the aspect of a language that is most idiomatic and characteristic, and at the same time the most difficult for foreign speakers to master, is its rules for the use of words that describe spatial and temporal relationships. We learn our prepositions at our mother's knees, not by them or before them. And heaven help any adult who must struggle with them later in life. But just as any language characterizes the state of consciousness of a people or a culture, as Bearfield, Whorf, and others argue, so it is the idiosyncrasies of our spatial metaphor that prepositional usage reflects. The people of one culture and tradition experience and communicate about space differently from those of another. And since our space constructs are fundamental metaphors by which we represent our experiences to ourselves, since they are the a priori categories that we use to organize our otherwise chaotic perceptions, they must reflect our particular idiosyncratic and unique view of the world. It is this deeply felt view that our mother tongue evokes with its idiomatic use of prepositions. These common yet elusive little words conceal our most intimate beliefs about the nature of reality. Prepositions form the invisible linguistic scaffolding of space and time. And I think that is really interesting. I'm just going to say that again. And since our space constructs are the fundamental metaphors by which we represent our experiences to ourselves, since they are the a priori categories that we use to organize our otherwise chaotic perceptions, they must reflect our particular idiosyncratic and unique view of the world. It is this deeply felt view that our mother tongue evokes with its idiomatic use of prepositions. These common yet elusive little words conceal our most intimate beliefs about the nature of reality. Prepositions form the invisible linguistic scaffolding of space and time. And so I think this is really kind of cool because language, right? Like language is like we internalize it, we're brought up with it, we project it forward, it shapes our world, it shapes our worldview, what we can imagine, what we find it possible to imagine. And I think that's why the erasure of indigenous cosmology was so central, was to erase that way of being in the Enlightenment thinking, right? The conquest happened, and then those older ways of those older cosmologies needed to be taken out. But now those languages and traditions are being brought back in, but they're being brought back in often through digital media, through online language learning, because I think the machine needs to know that. The machine needs to understand those older cosmologies in a way that is computationally available to it. So, while I totally understand the drive to put indigenous lost languages into the online space so that more people can learn them and preserve them, the other side of that is that then the machine also learns and understands that way of being. So that's very interesting. And I think this also relates to our push into towards automatic translation, right? Towards automatic translation services, the way in which that's going to fit in with global telepresence labor systems, and that's enabling, and the role of code as a universal language, right? That it's a language that the machine can just immediately access because it understands the coded nature, and that's like a universal language. And then also my work around Irvin Laszlo, who is in systems theory, and he was part of this emergent man, with the Foundation for Integrated Education and Ludwig von Bertalanffy and general systems theory. Laszlo was very much about, I'm pretty sure, Esperanto, or maybe, and Baha'i. The Baha'i were about Esperanto. And so that's another like universal language. But then what happens when you get a universal language if you lose the idiosyncrasy of the way in which culture is embedded in language, right? If you come up with the universal, you're going to lose something in the translation per se. So, so if you guys are still up for it, since I have some people who are still here, I've been doing some revisiting of some of my earlier blog posts, and especially around the education stuff, because I know we're back into the education space. And I have two things I might read, just to kind of put them out into people's headspace about back to school. And some of it is actually related to this future of education and remote robotic labor and telepresence labor and languaging. One of the articles I wrote in December of 2019, so like really just a quarter before everything broke loose, and it was actually a testimony that I gave, and I'll share the link in the post about it, because I actually have testimony, like 10 minutes of recorded testimony, about our city having a poverty committee and setting up this poverty committee. Only it was missing all the major things about the gig economy and what was coming with automation and every impact finance and everything else. So I kind of laid out in this post what was coming. And then the second one, if you guys are still hanging out and we have time, I'll do one about a Sesame workshop and targeting refugee families, Syrian refugee families, through the Nudge Unit, with educational technology that was developed and initially piloted in Atlanta public schools, and what that says for sort of collective swarm intelligence and this sort of Holon-based swarm consciousness that they're trying to go after. So, okay, so this, and again, I will say these articles are both from my more progressive left-leaning, we all develop as people, or we should, if we get new information, we should be developing and evolving our understanding of things. So if you hear this sound more left, like now I recognize, and I'm not saying that these issues are not all real authentic issues, but I understand the way in which the polarity is manufactured to advance the program. And so I think had I done this over again today with what I know now, I might have framed some things a little differently. So just fair warning on that. So this is called, it's from December 6th, 2019. Poverty Won't Be Solved by Committee. Education for Liberation, Less Data and More Free. And I have a picture here. I had a banner. It says, children are not data, human capital, or impact investing opportunities. And we're holding it up at this meeting at a vocational high school. It says, the video below is public testimony I gave to the Jobs and Education Subcommittee of Philadelphia's City Council Special Committee on Poverty Reduction and Prevention on Thursday, December 5th, 2019, at Dobbins Career and Technical Education High School in North Philadelphia. It is my belief that this committee was created to jumpstart pay for success initiatives in our city, a city of deep poverty. You can read about the predatory nature of pay for success finance here. And then I have a linked article. And there's an image, a screenshot, and it says, it's from the Economy League, and it says, Greater Philadelphia's potential as a center of the impact economy. No single region can claim to be the epicenter of the impact economy. As of yet, there is still no Silicon Valley of the impact economy. In regions where the impact economy is largest, it is dwarfed by other segments of the technology and innovation community, potentially frustrating those emerging leaders who want to be seen as economic leaders in their community. So I don't know if Lynn Davenport's out there. I would imagine that probably Dallas and Philadelphia might be competing to be the center of the impact economy at this point. So this is the blog. It says, in 2016, the Economy League of Greater Philadelphia prepared a white paper lauding Philadelphia's potential to become a center for the impact economy. Perhaps we could even aspire to be the Silicon Valley of impact. Yes, we have that much poverty, and mainline venture capital interests are falling all over themselves to package the data of misery management for tidy profit. See my previous blog post on social impact investing and public education in Philadelphia. It was such a long hearing with 6 official panels and over 20 approved speakers. And as the final panel was wrapped up 2.5 hours later, I inquired to see where I was on the list of public speakers. A small group of us, including 2 wonderful kids who had kept themselves busy drawing on the extra agendas, had been sitting patiently with our banner, Children Are Not Data, Human Capital, or Impact Investing Opportunities. All that time. And only then was I told that there would be only one more speaker. And the rest of the 20 plus people, including me, who had been pre-registered with the intention of sharing our thoughts on education, workforce development, and poverty, were out of luck. Too bad. At that point, I loudly protested. Imagine that. I had shared 30 plus copies of my testimony with a bunch of folks in the audience, letting them know I was on the list to speak. And I saw a lot of people reading it. And they knew I had things to say, and quite a few nodded in agreement when I spoke up. And ultimately, the subcommittee, chaired by Charmaine Matlock Turner of the Urban Affairs Coalition, acquiesced, allowing those speakers who hadn't already left, which was 8 of us, to testify. And somehow they still left my name off the list, even though I had email confirmation from Councilwoman Quinones Sanchez's legislative aide, who was coordinating that part of the event. And finally, I was told I could sit in the front row, and I was the very last one to speak. It should be noted that Pedro Ramos, the former School Reform Commission member and president of the Philadelphia Foundation and an advisor to Impact PHL, left before any members of the public came up to testify. And during the official panel discussion, he had inquired about out-of-school work-based learning, including what policy changes would need to be made to allow this to happen in public schools. And he cited the Cristo Rey school franchise as a model. Now, Cristo Rey seems to have a rising profile in San Jose, too. San Jose is another city of LRNG with many similarities to Philadelphia, which I describe here. And this is something we need to keep an eye on, given that the Vatican's has an expressed interest in impact investing. So Cristo Rey, essentially they closed a lot of parish Catholic schools in Philadelphia, and then they implemented new schools that were disconnected from parish structures. And so they were technically Catholic schools, but they weren't part of the community anymore. And they were part of this impact finance structure. And they were working on getting kids to do work-based learning as part of their education. And a lot of these were actually serving low-income students whose schools were closed in North Philadelphia. And so even with subsidies, a lot of these families were very low income, and they were having to pay $3,000 to $5,000 tuition, even with their scholarships, so that their kids could go to the non-parish-based Catholic schools, because their local schools, their public schools, had also been closed or made terrible. So it was really a bad scene all around. So in my testimony, I reference the quote unquote Parents as Consumers Symposium that Social Innovation Partners had planned for last June. So that would be June 2018. That event ended up being abruptly canceled when word got out about the agenda, which included both pay for success and education savings accounts. And this is really important, the education savings account stuff. The Parents as Consumers Symposium. So all of you conservatives out there who have maybe been lobbying for school choice and not realizing it was going to be attached to blockchain vouchers, this is like that piece. It was State Representative Frank Ferry and the Social Innovation Journal invite you to a symposium titled Social Innovation in Community Civic Engagement, Parents as Consumers in Education on June 15, 2018. The symposium will be accompanied by a Social Innovations Journal special edition publishing 20 articles framing the issue of civic engagement and parents as consumers. So you can kind of see that. It says state legislative models to discuss educational savings accounts. Education savings accounts allow parents to withdraw their children from public, district, or charter schools and receive a deposit of public funds into government subsidized savings accounts with restricted but multiple uses. So that's it. They want to kill the public schools. They want to actually kill like the private schools and control them. They want to give you the blockchain voucher, and then they want to pretend that there's a choice. And this goes on in this announcement about this 2018 thing that got canceled because I yelled about it. It said, should Pennsylvania consider a pay for success pilot to test these parents as consumer options to improve educational outcomes? These contracts would allow private investors to pay for an intervention. And if the intervention is successful, investors receive a return on their investment from the government, depending on the degree. So the vouchers, the blockchain education vouchers, the choice vouchers are always going to be melded with the human capital investing. Among the panelists planning to participate in the event, which was hosted by Bucks County State Representative Frank Ferry and Nicholas Torres' Impact Catalyst, the Social Innovations Journal, was Brian McElwee. McElwee is an investor, but not just any investor. He is apparently known as a finder, which according to an investigative article on him from the Inquirer in 2016, is a kind of matchmaker who connects investment professionals to elected officials who control government contracts. McElwee is also board chair of the Independence Mission Schools. Those are the schools I was talking about, a non-parish affiliated Catholic school nonprofit set up in 2012 to run urban schools in Philadelphia, schools where I expect there's a lot of potential for measurable impact. So even though the symposium was ultimately canceled, that event is significant. And we must recognize that faith-based initiatives will be a growing aspect of privatization efforts moving forward. And families who have children in ESA-funded alternative work-based Catholic schools are likely to be subjected not only to the expectation of compulsory child labor, but that their data will be harvested for impact investing deals tied to pay for success. After a very long wait, on my birthday no less, I felt vindicated because even though there were only about 20 people left in the audience by the time I presented, I was able to add my extensive findings to the public record. I also asked for the California NAACP resolution opposing linking blockchain digital identity to public benefit systems, which I referenced at the previous hearing on housing, be added to the record. Below is that resolution adopted in the spring of 2019. A similar resolution passed with overwhelming support at the national meeting of the NAACP in Detroit on July 1st of 2019. I believe the model legislation presented here will be useful in helping educate the public about the dangers of digital tracking systems and to protect targeted populations from predatory finance and Internet of Things surveillance. And that's a huge part of what I'm going to be talking about in this piece that comes out on Saturday. Is I feel like very much that the crypto symposium that was put out by Stephen Deal and Darren Sang with various more high-level, more covert influences is about setting up social impact finance, setting up the good kind of blockchain, right? The social justice kind, the equitable kind, this kind that upholds the social contract, right? And that's how the language is going to be. You create the problem and then you offer the solution. Um, I encourage folks to bring this information to organizations of which you are a part and encourage them to adopt or adapt it to your needs. We need to be proactive as the push to link digital vouchers to pay for success human capital contracts begins to ramp up. And again, so I'm saying this in December of 2019. I mean, I was saying it even earlier, but I was begging people to take this idea of digital identity, a blockchain identity, and understand the way in which it was going to be linked to social impact finance. Not by China, not a Chinese social credit score. This was coming through us. This was coming through the MIT Digital Currency Initiative and Learning Machine is where this came from. Okay. And there's still, most people still are not getting it. You know, it's still not really getting out there in any big way. Although I have to say, Lynn just had a really nice podcast and she covered a lot of these bases, which is great. The more people who can speak to this, the better. I stream my testimony and people around the country are watching it. It seems that I have been able to put the pieces together in ways others have not. And once we start to see the bigger picture, identifying resistant strategies becomes possible. Active non-cooperation is key, as my hero, John Trudell, said. And you know what? People genuinely seem to appreciate it. Sure, it's upsetting information, but it's better to know so that we can plan. Together, we can carve solidarity out of the dystopia capitalism has created, and it's time to look squarely at the truth and prepare for an age of automation and human capital debt finance. All we have is each other. Love and peace, folks. Okay, so this is my testimony that I gave, and it is recorded. So I'll have the link, and you can watch me deliver it if you want. We are living in a time of extreme wealth and devastating poverty. The future of work is highly uncertain. Based on pronouncements from the Markle Foundation, the Aspen Institute, Pearson, and Tom Vander Ark's Global Education Futures Initiative, we need to be paying attention to the rise of artificial intelligence, globalized platform labor, and human-robot collaboration. The MacArthur Foundation and its spinoff, Collective Shift, have spent millions of dollars promoting gamified digital media and learning, and Philadelphia is one of their pilot cities of LRNG. Many LRNG cities are also smart cities, Dallas, Chicago, San Diego, and San Jose among them. Digital learning is central to the premise of the learning ecosystem advanced by KnowledgeWorks based in Cincinnati, and its cradle to career social impact offshoots strive together. The latter works closely with United Way through a collective impact network focused on predatory pay-for-success human capital management. Those in power have reimagined education. And in this future, decentralized learning ecosystems replace bricks and mortar schools. Okay, so that's blockchain. That's Pokemon Go blockchain. Learning is privatized, outsourced to online providers, nonprofits, and corporations. Okay, so when you have these vouchers, these digital vouchers, it's mostly going to be online, and it's going to open up all sorts of new markets, and then they're going to co-opt all of the teachers as edupreneurs, and then it's going to be gig economy, you know, like Airbnb for your education space, and rankings and leaderboards and micropayments and all of that. That's what privatization looks like, and it's going to be disgusting. There are a few community drop-in centers, mostly staffed by AmeriCorps youth. So that's what the schools that survive, that's what they're going to look like. They're going to look like drop-in centers. There's going to be a few of them in the region. Now, they need something that passes as school to exist, because in order to get the data for the impact finance deals, which they can't get through HIPAA at this point, they need FERPA, which is the Family Education Rights Privacy Protection Act, something like that. And Obama gutted that. So there needs to be something, at least digitally or in the real world, that looks like school. And then you'll drop in and you'll meet with your caseworker. Academic and behavioral competencies are kept in online learning record stores. Yeah, and there's your digital twin. I didn't know it was a digital twin back then. AI mentors and synthetic people supplant human teachers and peers. And that's what the University of California, Southern California Institute for Creative Technology, it's essentially Disney and the Army Research Lab, have developed synthetic people to do that, to train you up, to get your crystal all optimized for whatever the crystalline lattice infrastructure for the global signaling, ascension, whatever. Learning is engineered by neuroscientists, right? So like, why are all the neuroscientists there? Like, that's why they want to get in your brain. They would like to ride your consciousness to the connection, the inherent energetic connection we have to the universe. Internet of Things sensors and XAPI impose educational surveillance. And that's going back, that's linking to Cello and SEP Camvar and Wildflower Montessori schools and sensors in the slippers to track social relations, and Charles Eisenstein's Sacred Economics, all set up to make it sound like beautiful money, right? And so that's where that's going. Badges developed in partnership with Mozilla substitute for degrees. So that's life on the ledger. And social emotional learning, like that's a huge amount of this. Is they don't actually want you to know stuff, because if you know stuff, then you're become a problem. They want to know how you feel, and that's actually what the AI. This is like soul harvest, really. Like they really want to know what is it that makes you tick. What is it, and to get into that and try to break that open. Lifelong learning is funded using digital vouchers that link payment to the delivery of specified performance metrics. So yeah, this is all key performance indicators. Know your customer, key performance indicator, leaderboard culture. In the game, we're all in the game. Accept vouchers, hand over the data. And in this way, even homeschool families will be sucked in. Algorithms screen job candidates' credentials along with psychographic information pulled from custom designed human resources video games. And that's something Rockefeller has been pushing. Call it people analytics. Black and brown children are risk profiled from birth and plugged into planned regional economies or incarceration or the military, managed for the benefit of the corporate state, increasingly Google and cyber defense interests. Yeah. And so the people in this game of pay for success finance, the more broken you are, the more they can profile you as being broken, the more valuable you are as a commodity. And so people who have a lot of epigenetic trauma, that's going to be their focus, both global South and Black and brown communities and indigenous communities, because they can document that harm and then take credit. Dystopia. Yes, we are there. And in this future, opportunity youth, that's the term they use, are trained as middle skill, that's another term, middle skill fodder for the fourth industrial revolution. Dehumanized education employs virtual apprenticeships upon which Lumina, Salesforce, and the Robin Hood Foundation place wagers, betting for and against a person's life outcomes data. And that seems to be what motivated bipartisan support for the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, the Pay for Success provisions in the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, seed funding from the Social Impact Partnerships Pay for Results Act to get the ball rolling. Evidently, there is a lot of money to be made gambling on poor people. And yeah, this is fully bipartisan. And I appreciate that in the most recent interview that Lynn did, Lynn Davenport, that she definitely made it very clear, even though that her positionality in this is in Texas, which is portrayed like in the different side of the polarity than Philadelphia, that this is fully bipartisan. People are being sold on coding as the pathway out of poverty, not realizing it's this generation's piecework. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and now STEAM, they put A in there for art. Sweatshops to build augmented reality smart worlds for those who run the cloud, and the hedge funds that finance them will start to emerge in federal opportunity zones. So if you haven't seen it yet, like definitely look up where the opportunity zones are in your community. There was federal legislation, so every governor was supposed to pick 25% of its low-income census tracts, and it's essentially money laundering. So that's where they're going to start. That's the early gaming simulation spaces will be these opportunity zones. Digital on-ramps put in place by Michael and Lisa Nutter. Michael Nutter was our mayor years ago with smart city money from IBM. Wait in the wings as Philadelphia's education fund STEM ecosystem ramps up. So these badges, for us, they were called digital on-ramps, and they were backed by a lot of money on IBM. Authentic knowledge will be replaced with isolated online learning, out-of-school time education, Pokemon Go style micro-knowledge aligned to the interests of funders like Dow, Chevron, Amgen, and Motorola. And this is really important because if you imagine like the stuff we were just talking about in the physics book about space, is they want people to feel isolated. They want people to feel disconnected so that they can manage them better. And that's all part of their strategy. Those in power see children as raw material to be run through the federal labor database, ONET. You should look that up, ONET, in Raleigh. EDS and MEDS. Those are the divisions they're putting everyone into. EDS and MEDS, skills delivered in quantities sufficient to suppress wages while optimizing profit. And this is the thing that's really hard for me is like, when I was seeing this at the time, what was going on was there was a lot of organizing within the conservative circles against Common Core state standards. And it was kind of the culture wars all over again. Like the conservatives had it right on a lot of things, but then they would like miss a chunk that really made their strategies insufficient. And the chunk was buried in the ideology, right? Like they were like, someone's coming and doing this to us. And I'm like, y'all, like a lot of these folks from New York, I'm like, y'all, this is IBM. I'm like, this is your folks. Go home in your backyard and like clean this stuff up because this came from New York. And but the Stop Common Core folks could never like get their mind around that it wasn't the socialists exactly. It was actually that the Chamber of Commerce was setting this up. And a lot of this was coming out of the National Center for Education and the Economy and Mark Tucker in Rochester. And now, here it's like 4 or 5 years later, and I'm realizing about Rochester as the center of optics and photonics technology and digital twinning, that I had no clue. Like I was so green, back then. There were so many parts of the story I hadn't bumped into yet. So yeah, ONET. If global capital is going to engineer the economy, the Chamber of Commerce, that they're going to engineer like whatever simulation model they've said that they needed to overtrain so that they can depress wages and cream the best of the crop, right? And then leave everybody else hanging. So that's not going to work out. I mean, anybody from a sense of logic will realize that that's not a good plan. Like, and it's not a socialist plan. I'm not saying the socialists wouldn't maybe do it in a different way, but having the Chamber of Commerce run the planned regional economies, especially when in Philadelphia on our anti-poverty committee, what they were saying is like they weren't even paying attention to the gig economy, and our top growth jobs were all paying, like, with the exception of a few managers or accountants that were paying 30 or 50 bucks an hour, the top 15 jobs were all paying like 15 or 12 or $8 an hour, which you can't live. Like you absolutely can't live on that. So that's the future that they're planning. And the politicians, neither side are stopping it. Like they weren't stopping it in Philadelphia. They were just paying lip service. They had their program set up so that they could set up this impact finance space. And that's what's that, and clearly the lockdowns were all part of that. Okay. Okay. So meanwhile, educational pathways are tracked for value added growth data to run the pay for success futures markets. Learning Machine, that's MIT, they've set up these blockchain transcripts with Paul LeBlanc at Southern New Hampshire University. And Google is very much in bed with all of that. And Dr. Haidt served with him as an educational advisor at Ridge Lane Limited Partners. So y'all all go look up Ridge Lane, RIDGE Lane, LANE, LC, I think. Brad Lane. And those are the people I was running into, having no clue what I was actually dealing with. These are the top level. This is Tom Ridge. And once you understand that the simulation modeling cubes are linked to Homeland Security and the fusion centers and, highest level science and simulation modeling, you start to realize like, oh, yeah, I thought I was just fighting standardized tests and school closures, but that was like not the thing. And R. Brad Lane he has been a special guest at Stanford University in education, I think since 2016, like who knows what. And I think it's dealing with consciousness. It's dealing with this next stage of ed tech consciousness simulation modeling. So yeah, look at the advisors of Ridge Lane, just scroll through because it goes on for like 200. And you'll see, like, this is the digital conquistadors, like this is digital empire. And you don't have to look to Beijing for any of this. You don't have to look to Tel Aviv for that. You don't have to look to London. You don't have to look to Kazakhstan, although it's embedded in all of those things too. Like all you have to do is look at Ridge Lane and all of the bipartisan people that they have lined up. Okay. So yeah, so I bumped Dr. Haidt off of the Ridge Lane board. Who knows if he really went away, but he left the website. And then he was replaced, unfortunately, by Tom Vander Ark, who is like the global education futures guy. So I don't know that I was doing anybody any favors. So Dr. Haidt, but whom should we ask about Amply, the pre-K blockchain identity app launched by Innovation Edge in Cape Town? I hear that folks in Philadelphia have been briefed, but I don't know who's the project lead. And that goes through to connect to Temple University. And Ben Goertzel of Sophia the Robot got his PhD in math from Temple. Worker productivity is high, wages low, and precarious employment is the norm. Closed-door deals are struck as Chamber of Commerce insiders line up the policy, finance, and technological infrastructure needed to control the masses. Pay for success, Moneyball, What Works Government, behavioral economics, The Nudge. Every policy wonk philanthropist, global consultant, and sold-out academic pitches techno solutions for poverty as the Federal Reserve looks on, pretending compliance by the oppressed will somehow magically return them to prosperity. And that's, where I was at. Like the panel, like the hearing before this one on education was on housing. And I kept saying, you can make the poor jump through every hoop that you lay out there and track them with their Internet of Things blockchain identity, but it's not going to make the money that Jeff Bezos has aggregated. Like at this time, Jeff Bezos was setting up his Pay for Success big slush funds for pre-K and for homelessness. It's not going to make Bezos's money come down to the poor. It's simply going to make more money go up to Bezos. It doesn't make any more money for those people. Like it's not going to improve their life circumstances to keep making them jump more and more hoops faster and faster and faster. And that's what this game is about. So no, justice will not come from more data. What we need is the will to redistribute resources from a billionaire class steeped in white supremacy. Resources must go directly to poor folks, and self-determination is key. It is wrong to channel money through intermediaries whose continued existence depends on intractable poverty. And this goes back again to, if you make poverty profitable, the logic of the market says you'll only have slightly ameliorated poverty that is better managed, and you'll grow that market. That's just the logic of. Now, I will say, on the other hand, like it is also like the socialists are lining up to have their tokenomics cooperatives too. So I'm still like, I was coming from a certain mindset at that time, and I realized that the polarity in that is not super helpful, and that the structure of domination has ensured that there are people of color woven throughout all of the managerial class and the think tanks and the academic support systems and the political levers to make sure that this moves forward with the rubber stamp of those communities, at least the slice of people who got the brass ring and became part of the system. Okay. And I can't blame them, for making those choices, but that's how this machine works. It's not to there's nothing about this new version that's going to undermine that power. So instead of coffles, and coffles are like the neck things that enslaved people had to wear, digital peonage will chain people through biometric digital identity linked to public benefits. And eventually, if they get their way, this will include education savings accounts to purchase competency-based education on the open market. The data is being fed back into Pay for Success finance education deals. Look up State Representative Frank Ferry and Social Innovation Journal's Parents and Consumer Symposium, planned for June 15, 2018, but abruptly canceled. The agenda clearly describes the goal of linking ESAs to Pay for Success. And so here we are at Dobbins Career and Technical Education High School to discuss education and poverty. Some still trusted elected officials to deliver their children opportunities for stable lives, presuming they work hard. And yet the reality of pending labor automation is harsh and unforgiving. Who is going to tell the public there will be no more shop teachers, and that the plan is to outsource work-based learning? No one is going to say they were replacing neighborhood schools with IBM and Ford training centers. And no one wants to admit that the National Center on Education and the Economy's proposal, laid out by Mark Tucker in his Dear Hillary letter, is ready to launch, and that most future jobs will be gigs. And even those gigs will only go to those with the right brand starting in pre-K, and maybe at Hatch Education surveillance playtables. Those in power are watching, always watching, and the rise of the robot class means people are becoming more and more disposable. The United States compulsory education system has been used since its inception to reinforce divisions of race and class, and it delivers human capital to meet industrial interests needs. Youth trained just enough to do the work required, but not to imagine a future beyond the one defined by the pathways on which they are put. What is needed to eliminate poverty is revolutionary transformation. Poverty reduction is not about narrowing gaps. That rift was already far too great, even as the founding fathers hammered out our duplicitous constitution. And it was pretty duplicitous, actually, if you go back and look at it. The system isn't broken. Trump didn't break it, and neither did DeVos. Our education system is working exactly as intended. And this is from Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. With false generosity, he attempts not only to preserve an unjust and necrophilic order, but to buy peace for himself. It happens that peace cannot be bought. Peace is experienced in solidarity and loving acts, which cannot be incarnated in oppression. We need to become conscious, and we need the oppressed to wake up to the sinister intent of the planned fourth industrial revolution, and we need education for liberation. Liberation will not be attained through an appointed committee. It is created in the streets, doing the work with love and solidarity, and that is where we need to be. And so I will just say, that's where I was then. I do think that maybe being in the streets is not the most helpful place, because that is actually their place. That is the smart city. And polarization is also not super helpful. And clearly, like, Brazil is also being targeted by all of these same things by the socialists. So it's complicated. It's complicated and interesting. you know, and I don't know what the answer is. Like, for me, the answer right now is to try to communicate with life. And that's why, even though maybe it was a little long and boring, like, why I thought this was pretty interesting was, like, there are other ways of thinking about the world and thinking about space and time and the continuum and the connectedness and things that were really powerful that we lost. And so maybe we can get that back. Maybe we do that through creative, imaginative, playful, chaotic engagement with the world. I think it should come from a loving place, because when you try to go at something from an aggressive standpoint, I learned that from my initial foray, making some clips about the crypto skeptic conference, that if you're too assertive, that gives license to the powers that be to go womp womp, and try to get you. So I think the oblique, discreet stance, the smooth movement through, and the try to waking people up to a different story is really good. I think since there's still people here, I might read the second article. This was the other one that I was going to read. We have a really interesting conversation that's been ongoing on the discourse. I can't remember. Someone, I think in Vancouver, initially started it, and it's about physics and knot theory, and portals, and I don't know, conceptualizations of time and space. And it's a bit hard for me to wrap my mind around, but the way in which the pretzel logic of some of these things is actually being embedded in popular culture, and the Simpsons, and there was literally a Sesame Street where Gonzo was making some monster out of pretzels, which reminded me of the whole Seinfeld, these pretzels are making me thirsty, and these random things where pretzels are encoded into our consciousness, right? We don't even know why. Why would we say, these pretzels are making me thirsty? But there was this Gonzo pretzel monster, and I thought, I'm going to touch on this other piece about Sesame Workshop. And beyond targeting opportunity youth in opportunity zones in red, poor neighborhoods in urban locations, the refugee community is huge, and it's growing in enormous ways. And it's because, not exclusively, but part of this is that they want to use them as a test bed for the emerging technologies and digital welfare systems and AI tracking for sort of swarm intelligence behaviors, and embedding cyber physical systems, payment systems, food service systems, smart, throw up smart housing systems into it. They're trying to use refugee populations with digital media and remote work so that they can code the metaverse, so they can do cybersecurity for the metaverse, so they can tag the AI photos, right? Their kids can do online gaming that are tied to a blockchain identity that earn NFTs and script that they can then maybe buy some food in the refugee settlement store. I mean, that's the thing that we're working on. And so this one is even earlier. At the time, I'm going to link to this, and I want to read this one next, maybe not today, but the next time I come on. I worked really hard on this long thing that was really focused on sort of swarm intelligence and refugee populations and the Vatican and these small towns. And because I know that this is at the core of what it is, to unsettle populations, to dislocate them, and then to throw them into new places, and then to see how they restructure society, and to do that within a surveillance system, right? And they'll give you all sorts of surveillance and say that's to keep you safe, because they want to see how it works. That's what the AI wants, is to see how it works. And so with all the things I've just said about how we know about education savings accounts and parents and consumers, that's being sold to the West, to the global North, like to conservative families. Oh, just do school choice and we'll give you a voucher and you can pay for your mission school. But by the way, we're going to actually close the bricks and mortar ones and we're going to send your kid to work-based learning and we're going to put them on games. What it looks like in the refugee community is Learn Card, which is something that's come out from Learning Economy Foundation, which is embedded in the UN, and the Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is the ed tech, which is the human capital finance space. And yeah, all of that's going to be tracked, and that's what the refugees are going to get for their ID 2020 no one left behind world. And the people who are behind this, these tablets were initially piloted in a suburban Atlanta community. Now, at the time I wrote this in 2018, I didn't really have an understanding of one, health stuff wasn't on my radar. So the CDC being in Atlanta, didn't really understand that. The role of Georgia Tech as a defense space, a nanotech broadcast wireless space, didn't really understand that either. So there were a lot of aspects about Atlanta that I didn't understand. And then the way in which Sesame Street has been embedded in to create these, again, avatar class beings, right? Like if you think about it, and I was born in 68, so I can, that was the year all of this came out, that you have empathy and emotion for critters, right? And Dallas schools are now doing these NFTs for good behavior, and they're called red critters. So you're supposed to have empathy for these other things that are artificial. And now that's going to be leveraged, I think, into the artificial reality space, into these avatars, into things that it may look like a critter, but it may be like some old dude pedophile, or it may look like a critter, but it may be some other kid. It may be something it may be a toaster. You don't even know what is behind this thing that is representing itself as a Muppet. So this is called Who is Pulling the Muppet Strings? And I have the image here is it is a refugee tent, and there's two little boys with dark hair, and there's a yellow Muppet with orange hair, and around it I have all these strings on the Muppet that I applied, and it says the Nudge Unit, JP Morgan, the Rockefeller Foundation, IBM, Goldman Sachs, Intel, Cisco, Microsoft, Reach Capital. So it was all these things. And I remember when I put it out, because people were like, man, you're going after Sesame Street? How dare you, Allison? And I was like, well, I don't know what else to say. This is bad. The things that are happening are bad. And the way in which you can see, I think, as I read through this, how the templating of this model of getting devices into homes, which in this case were refugee communities, tents, are going to be not unlike having the Chromebooks or the wearables or the VR headsets with the Kinect and the Wii and the haptics in your living room. In a suburban Dallas or Atlanta living room. It's the same dynamic, right? But they have to start somewhere with figuring out how to do the stuff. And so they start with these populations. So, okay, so I'll start. Sesame Street is an iconic brand that embodies humor, acceptance, and humanity. Who doesn't love a Muppet? So on December 20th, when the MacArthur Foundation, now remember, they're the ones behind digital media and learning, announced that they were giving Sesame Workshop and the International Rescue Committee $100 million to educate young children from displaced Syrian families and help them deal with toxic stress, most people were thrilled. And while the optics were great, I'm here to tell you that these Muppets are definitely not the type of friends Syrian refugee children need. How will Sesame Workshop and the IRC spend the MacArthur Award money? Well, much of it will be spent on educational technology. Sesame branded educational content delivered on televisions, phone, and digital platforms. Home visits reinforced by digital content and parenting resources provided by mobile devices. So the parents are a whole nother second. It's two generations that they want. So they want the kids on the cybernetic pathway, and they want the families on the cybernetic pathway. And actually, somebody who was in the comments, she had shared with me insights about Mexico, that they're actually training the kids in Mexican classrooms to assign, their signature that they're aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and kind of then come into their own homes and police their families about it. So that's, I guess not shocking, but that's the direction that this is all going, right? So they want to get into your homes, and they're going to do it through home visits. And again, I feel bad for the people who are going to be tapped to do the home visits, because they're not bad people. Like nobody signs up to be a home visitor because they want to taunt people, or like, maybe there's a tiny fraction, like an aberration of somebody who like gets off bossing people around, but most people really are there because they want to help. And then their job is going to essentially be to do everything but help, and then put the people on the pathway and get the sticks and carrots and poke them and keep them there. So if we want to make it better for everyone, we have to both make it better for folks who are being preyed upon by the systems and the folks that are going to be tasked with preying upon the people, because everybody's going to be hurt. Okay. And these could be people that you care about. This could be you or people that you care about. So child development centers equipped with video clips pre-recorded on projectors and activity sheets. This approach exactly reflects concerns raised by an April 2017 report published by Education International on the education of Syrian refugee children. That report found that many donors were providing quote unquote decontextualized interventions that focused too much on technology. A follow-up story by Anya Kamenetz noted that such an approach was highly problematic in settings with limited access to electricity. EdTech is not what the schools and teachers needed or wanted. But for every one donor offering to provide a soccer ball, there were 10 that wanted to provide tablets and online learning systems. It is rare for funds to be provided for basics like teacher salaries, books, instructional material, and even bathrooms. Now, eventually the bathrooms will be part of Pay for Success too. So the bathrooms will be put online, and then they'll have money for bathrooms, but not yet. They don't have the Stanford is probably still trying to work out the kinks on their smart potties and their anal sphincter biometrics. Instead, NGOs and entities like the World Bank and UNESCO have been diverted to pushing digital technology solutions that deliver educational services to refugee children and families. Now, they haven't been, So financial interests claim that digital platforms are a cost-effective way to supplement teachers, but instead children are being subjected to dehumanizing device-based instruction of the type promoted by Bridge International Academies. Such an approach also disregards growing concern about health and mental health risks associated with screen time in children. So now you've got the whole screen time crew, but these screen time people are a false front, and a lot of them are running out and they're saying, we just want the good screens, right? We want to reduce bad screen time and make sure the kids have quality screen time, right? So all of these screens and kids people, like, be very suspect, because they actually want to, they're not looking to take the tablets away. They're just making sure that it's better regulated. And there's an image here of two little girls and a boy at like a elementary school table with these plasticky kind of tablets and with handles and everything. And they've got Muppets and they're brown skinned children, and they have little girls have long brown braids, and they've got the Muppets there. And I have these arrows to the devices saying Muppet facilitated data extraction, because there's Muppets on there. Very simple ed tech. Few people are aware of the extent to which Sesame Workshop has embraced educational technology. They created the Joan Gantz Cooney Lab a decade ago to promote digital learning for young children. And these efforts are supported by tech companies like Intel, Microsoft, Motorola, and Cisco. The Gates Foundation is involved, as is the Bezos Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation, and social impact bond underwriters like the Pritzker Children's Initiative. In 2016, Sesame Workshop used proceeds from its sale of Sprout to launch a venture capital firm called Sesame Ventures with the Collaborative Fund and Reach Capital. They created 2 venture capital funds that provide technical support and funding to early stage ed tech startups aimed at individual consumers and school districts. Jeffrey Dunn, current president of Sesame Workshop, said in an interview that a typical venture capital portfolio aims to earn 3 to 5 times a return on investment. That's huge, right? Like, they're into getting these kids on devices because it's about money, but data. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate about all of the machine learning and the data. Dunn notes that Sesame Ventures is also an extension of the Sesame Workshop's past digital and commercial ventures in which he played a part. Okay, that same year, Sesame Workshop also partnered with IBM to develop branded AI apps for literacy and social emotional learning. Okay, so I was writing this like in 2018. The social emotional learning stuff has been going on for a long time, and it's being embedded within, again, these empathy. They gain your trust, and then they put you in the space to data mine you. They will use the Watson AI platform to provide personalized learning content based on the data they mine from children's online interactions. The apps were piloted in Gwinnett County, Georgia schools. And now with the MacArthur Award, Sesame Workshop, and IBM have access to an additional 1.5 million children to refine their digital education solutions. Okay. So they've got these massive returns on investment they're getting. And it's interesting. So this MacArthur grant was called 100 and Change. And it was, of course, an online competition. And, it's very interesting because I have another blog post about this, but one of the people who participated in this contest, which was won by the Sesame Workshop and the International Rescue Committee, was Angela Duckworth here in Philadelphia with the Character Lab, the Grit Lady, who's now being funded by Chan Zuckerberg. Now, she was looking at doing sort of nudges, digital nudges for health and education, and had her listed partners as being both Philadelphia School District and New York City Schools and I think CBS. There are a number of other ones. Like, you can sort of see how the evolutionary economic biocomputational piece was going to come into play. But she could only promise a fairly small number of kids, like the Philly kids and the New York kids, which is a large number, but certainly not 1.5 million. And guess what? Like, some of those kids would have parents like me would stand up and say, this is messed up. Like, what are you doing? This is not okay. What happens in refugee communities, right? Like, these people are destabilized. They've lost their community. Who is looking out for them? The International Rescue Committee? No, they're the ones that are looking to data mine them for venture capital profit. So who is looking out for these people? That is why it's really important to get the story straight and understand that this AI metaverse abomination is going after the least of these first, the most vulnerable, and then consuming that and then moving on to the rest of us. So we actually have to have the solidarity and to have the connectivity of what is human, what is the tree of man, to look out for our fellow beings, not in the big brother way that Michael Bloomberg wants, but in an authentic way, to actually stand up and go, no, this, you're saying this like it's a good thing, but I can tell that the underpinning of this is not good. And it's interesting. They made one of these videos private. In the meantime, there's a little girl and she's holding up her tablet, and it's just sad. They're telling knock jokes to avatars, to online Muppet avatars. More data will be uploaded to devices during home visits and informal learning settings, but who will have access to the data? Could it be used to profile children and families? Now, again, think these are vulnerable communities. The main people who are behind this social impact finance space for the Catholic Relief Charities group, she's connected with the Boston Archdiocese. Are you going to tell me they're going to set up blockchain mind files for refugee children, and that data is never going to be misused? That level of granular data that tells you every single vulnerability of a given child would not be leveraged towards harmful outcomes? I'm not buying it. There's just no protections in place for that yet. Let's see. Could it be used to profile children? Surely there will be some who will be hesitant to submit their children for social emotional screening by US affiliated organizations. IBM, anyone? Hello. Not just Holocaust, also South Africa apartheid. Might that information identify those families as potential security threats? What happens if they refuse to participate? These are important questions to ask, especially given IBM's history of business dealings with authoritarian regimes. And the Hollerith cards, right? It is important to note that another partner in this project is the Behavioral Insights Team, BIT, also known as the Nudge Unit. It is a social purpose company jointly owned by the UK government, the development of social impact bonds, and Nesta. The company uses behavioral science and digital platforms to address social problems by encouraging people to make better choices. Don't do something that's going to make you end up a refugee. Is that the better choice? That make public service delivery more cost effective, right? And additionally, the IRC is a member of Ideas 42, which is based in the US. It came out of Harvard. They're an organization that aims to use behavioral science to create scalable solutions for impact. Now, at the time, I was understanding all of this within a social control finance lens, but I wasn't yet getting to the point of understanding this as AI and swarm intelligence. And that's what I will say about Nesta. In the UK, and I kind of call this digital conquistadors, but it's sort of digital empire, right? Nesta in the social impact finance space, it's sort of embedded in the UK Department of culture, sport, and media. And I was having a hard time understanding the sport part, like the sport part. And I'm realizing now, having done more work into Peter Stone, who is the North American rep of Sony AI at UT Austin. He was working with, I can't remember the guy's name, but in Japan for like 20 years on training robots to play soccer. It's called RoboCup. And, they were getting better and better at it because it's teaming. So they're trying to, the next phase of evolution of the AI is not just that individual robotic units can work together, that they can work together as a swarm, and that's swarm drones. And they were using, I think now NAO, like these littleish robots to play soccer. And so they're really interested in how people work together or don't work together, or when it's effective or when it's not, or like goal-oriented behavior and collective goal-oriented behavior, because this is what is being sold to us right now as you need this because the world's going to end. And if you don't believe all of us, the world's going to end tomorrow unless you follow all our rules. So like we need to, do you mind if we borrow your mind for our Cloud Mind Collective Consciousness project? Because if not, the world's going to end tomorrow. Like, and I'm like, I'm just saying, I don't think we need to live in that mental state. They're trying to impose that mental construct on us. And I don't think that we actually need to live in that space, right? And so they're looking at the collective consciousness to hijack that using stories that they tell about us, like you better behave or something terrible is going to happen to you when you're children, to get at it. And imagine within this refugee camps, like I can just picture, sure, these tablets are the basic bare bones thing. Like these tablets are just, rubber, like that's just the start of the cognitive model, right? They want the biological model, they want the health model, they want the collective model. So what happens in the next 3 to 5 years when all the refugee camps, guess what? They get a smart jumper and smart shoes, right? All of the little blinkies in the kids' shoes, like you don't think that was predictive, like that was getting people ready for piezoelectric energy harvest. Like give them some smart shoes, give them a smart jumper, give them a smart watch, give them a smart soccer ball, and like get some drones flying overhead so that like even if they're disconnected from the internet, we'll get all of that data and then the drone can like fly back to the home base and upload it. And imagine, and this is so sick, but like so many groups of children giving them, like having this harvested, their play, their collaboration, their intuitive creativity into the space. And I will just say, the other thing beyond the swarm consciousness is I had a little back and forth with Leo because he was giving me some input on this piece that I'm going to put out this weekend. And he said, what's really interesting, Allison, is all of this cryptography needs randomness. And the challenge is within the mechanical system, it can't be random because it's programmed. So it actually has to look outside of itself to get the chaos, the randomness, to allow the cryptography to impose the order. So there is this synergy between the chaos and order. Like the order of the blockchain neural net can't be more than it is, which is a computational model, which isn't random. So it has to have this like reaching out to get at that thing and pull it back in. And one of the things that he shared with me was, I think Cloudflare, which I'm assuming is some cloud services company, that their encryption, the random catalyst of these encryption events were actually, they lined their lobby with shelves of lava lamps. Because evidently the lava lamp, every blobbity blob of the lava lamp that peels off is never, they never repeat the same thing twice. And then they would take a photo of it intermittently. And then they would render the photo digitally, which would turn it all into ones and zeros. And then that was the random computation because it would never be the same twice. And then they would upload it to their like cryptography for their cloud servers. And so I'm just thinking, like, what is more random than children? Like what is more random than the beautiful chaos? Like I live next door to a school and it's elementary school, and at recess, like there's like 2 or 3 hours of the day where they're like, screaming, running, like up and down, whatever. Like, and I keep thinking that this thing, like, what if there's some cloud computing company that's like, oh, that's my assigned refugee place. Like I'm going to have the kids play some soccer out there with the smart stuff. And like, that's where I'm getting my inputs for my crypto is from that randomness. And it might sound bizarre, but like, the fact that Nesta is culture, sport, and media, the sport part, the teaming part, the sitting on your shoulder and trying to figure out how you do it part, And then one of the other things that I realized in Philadelphia was like the austerity led to the removal of all the aides, like all the parent, like there were in our district, there were many parents who would get paid very low wages realistically for the amazing things they did to be in the schools to provide support, classroom aides. And they were often part-time with no benefits, and they did like yeoman's work to do this work. And then the austerity came, and even those positions were pulled. And so what happened was there was no one to watch the kids at recess. So the kids were getting stuck inside. And then what happened was you had something called Playworks, and then Playworks shows up, and it's an NGO. And so they would like, and then often in some schools, maybe they found foundation funding for it, but then parents would fundraise to pay the Playworks people to supervise the recess. And then it became structured play. And then it was play according to rules and rubrics and the right kind of play for the right social behaviors. And it was all structured. And one of the primary funders of Playworks is Bechtel, like the defense contractor. Now, why is Bechtel? Because Bechtel was doing education. It was the Bechtel Foundation, and they were all about the character education. So there's some dance happening between like the random chaos of children and nature and life, and the sitting on the shoulder and going, oh, I like that. Could you do that some more? But could you do it a little bit more like I like it like this? And then like the nudging into that space. Like, I think that's really important to think about. And I think that's not just in city playgrounds that are privatized and like the budget slashed, but this is in the refugee spaces. And then it's going to go from the kids with the tablets in the tents earning gamified script pigeon pellet behavior tokens so that their family can eat, to like, hey, why don't you put on that wearable and go play some soccer so that you can like power the cloud-based server? Like, that's where it's going to go. And then all of that stuff that they pilot is going to show up like boomerang back into the suburban Atlanta living room. And then they're going to tell like the conservative Christian agoric school choice people, like, here's your choice. Only they're not going to realize it's the same choice that was not really given to the refugee families. And they're going to embrace it like it's liberation. And that's the power story. It's like how you get out ahead and tell the story. Okay. So back to the thing. Okay. So the 100 and change. So yeah, they needed a lot of dispossessed people. So clearly the International Rescue Committee was going to provide them that. The 100 and Change Award aligns closely with MacArthur's digital media and learning and impact investment activities. And many of the members of the IRC board and overseers are involved in global finance and U.S. foreign policy. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, the Rockefeller Foundation, and numerous venture capital groups are represented. And while the MacArthur competition purportedly aimed to solve a critical world problem, its primary function was to promote the profit-taking social impact investment agenda, which has been advanced by the Rockefeller Foundation over the past decade. MacArthur is both a member and a funder of their global impact investing network. The non-winning proposals were put into a database, a solutions bank of potential future investments. It was an 18-month exercise that vastly expanded the infrastructure for the impact investment sector. And like the irony is that the solutions bank is housed at Penn, and literally the person, at least when I was doing this research, lives less than a block from me, right? Like, again, these are just regular people who live in row houses like me, who do the jobs. This is to manage the solution bank. And I will say the other piece about the digital media and learning for Rockefeller is, at the time I wrote this in 2018, I didn't fully appreciate the ways in which behaviors and dispositions and outlooks for mental models would be represented as badges. So when MacArthur was working very closely with Mozilla and something called HASTAC, H-A-S-T-A-C at Duke, to develop the badging systems for AI assorting human capital, I didn't really know in 2018 that it was also going to be actually maybe primarily the social emotional learning stuff would be represented as badges. So that's really important. And so they have the competition, lots of fanfare, have all the submissions, get the top 200. You award the one to like the crew that can give you the most bang for your buck, which is 1.5 million dispossessed, traumatized people. And then the rest of them you put in your solutions bank so the venture capital crowd can get the rest of it going. Sesame Workshop's program with Syrian refugees is an example of how foundations are paving the way for education to be reinvented as an exercise in data-driven behavior modification. Over the course of this 5-year project, traumatized families will be used to refine scalable online education and behavioral treatment models that generate data and profit for private investment interests. These efforts will be subsidized by foundations and made possible with assistance from complicit nonprofit actors. The products developed from the digital labor of these children will be deployed not only in future humanitarian efforts, but also among the growing ranks of children living in poverty in the United States and in other countries. The $100 million was not a charitable award. It was a business investment. Okay, so that's that. Trauma, right? And it's so sick when you look back and see how Sesame Street has positioned itself about like helping traumatized children. Like they knew, because the trauma and the ACEs scores are a key part of the impact finance simulation modeling. And I'm just going to say here, you know, I often talk about, like, I just have this little platform, right? Like if I'm lucky, I get about 1,000 people. And of those 1,000 people, I don't know, I shouldn't beat myself up about the analytics, but most people end up with like, they listen to 15 minutes of the 4-hour program. And so it feels like a drop in the bucket. And so early on in the lockdowns, I think I was kind of being like, you know, everybody's always like poking around to see who people really are and what they, you know, who they want to affiliate with. And I actually, Vanessa Beeley approached me to have a Zoom conversation. And I'm sure, because I was interesting, right? I was one of like, I don't know, maybe who is that other Twitter woman who was like, there's some woman and she's dirty as hell. Like, I don't know if it was that or whatever, but like people are trying to figure me out. Like, what's going on here? I'm like, literally, I'm just a mom. Like I wandered into the school door and I ended up in blockchain mindfile stackable credentials. But I asked her at the time, I said, listen, this is Syria. Like this is happening. You have a much, much bigger platform than me. And this needs to be understood better. Like there's all this stuff with Syria, but like, this is a huge thing. Like these learn cards, the sustainable development goals, the tech and everything. And like, you know, I just don't think it ever happened. And that's, you know, why I would say you need to be mindful of the stories that are being told, is that there are people who know that aren't telling this story for whatever reason. And that's why us little people have to be popping up and doing it. And I would say some of the stuff that I've been working on today, looking into simulation modeling and crystallography, because like I think a lot of it is crystallography, is they talk about nucleation. And I guess it's like snow, like there's, and that's what they do, I think, with the geo whatever bloppity blop that they drop in the sky. Like they nucleate things, they drop little bits and then they create crystal and structures, and then it falls down as snow or rain or whatever. But like the crystal lattices are the nucleating, like these little things that then can grow into crystals, like and grow into these lattices. And I sort of feel like influencer culture is kind of like crystallography. And one of these, they were actually talking about crystal lattice structures being represented dynamically by group theory, and that the social physics of segregation could be represented as crystal lattices and modeled as a crystal lattice. And so it's like, and then there was one nucleated crystal that got big and gobbled up all of the particles. And so I feel like we're in this dynamic moving simulation thing of whatever to try to get the word out. But I would say, like, please make these connections between the refugee populations and the people in your community, because there's not such a far distance between the gentleman that Lynn Davenport was talking about in Texas, who's looking at things from maybe a conservative lens, that there's very similar things happening in kids in Dallas and kids in these refugee camps. It's all connected. So, in this era of U.S. imperialism and late-stage capitalism, it seems the monster at the end of this book is, in fact, the nonprofit that opens a door and allows venture capital to harm 1.5 million vulnerable children. I hope the Sesame Workshop will reconsider their direction, disavow their ties to educational technology, and instead use MacArthur's $100 million to provide the non-digital human services Syria's refugee children so desperately need. I have to believe Jim Henson would want that. But I don't know. Who knows what story Jim Henson was listening to. So I just closed out. That'll be it. I see some folks are leaving, but the monster at the end of this book, it's like, oh, the monster at the end of this book. Like maybe it's us and maybe we're in the labyrinth and maybe we can walk out if we can see it. So anyway, thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you sort of see the interesting connections between how we see reality, the story we're in, the interesting idea that maybe the medieval or indigenous views of the world as animistic and interconnected and meaningful with purpose, where we're all flowing together, has some opportunities that are better, like, or at least offer some more potentiality than a stark geometrical Tron environment of blockchains. And you can see how where I was in 2018 and 2019 talking about the digital identity, the impact finance, the mind files. At this point, I hadn't gotten to understanding the AI and the machine learning, but now I do. Now I understand the swarm intelligence. Let's start laying this out. And, as I said in the beginning, like, I'm not perfect at this. I'm not trying to lead this. I'm putting information out in an outward way if it resonates. And if it doesn't resonate with you, fine. I don't think you need to throw rocks at me because I'm literally not trying to do anything that's hurting anybody. I'm not trying to say you shouldn't also do the things if you feel you want to do different things. Like if you're in a different story, if you're in a different phase, do those things. But we don't have to inhabit the space of me necessarily to do this work. And I feel like the person who got very engaged with my comment section and had this like dead end address, like Gmail address that I couldn't connect with, and seemed to be sort of glomming their vision into like sticking it in and like being distrustful of our discourse. If you're distrustful of that, or you don't like a moderated community, or you don't think that's free, that's fine. I'm not here to tell you that you should like that, right? Go set up your own group, do your own thing, make your own blog, make your own videos, write your own zine, sing your own song, have your own dinner party, have a picnic and play soccer, and and maybe this will come up. Like there are many, many ways to do this, and I'm just doing it the way I'm doing it, and I'm trying as hard as I can to sort of push off the responsibility of holding a big piece of it, because it's been a long time. Like 2018, it's and it is before that for me, but like it was crystallizing for me for these past 4 years. And you can do it. Like I believe in people. I believe in people's creativity, and I believe that they can get there and be confident. And just because I seem to know a lot, there's a ton of stuff I don't know every day. The more stuff that I don't know, I didn't know about crystalline lattices, but just be confident that you could learn it if you wanted to, and it made sense to you, and it helped you sort things out. So anyway, thanks for hanging out. Until next time. Next time I'm going to start working on the refugee piece, because that's the thing that actually drove me off of Twitter, was the fact that nobody could seem to engage with that refugee swarm intelligence conversation. So I think that needs more attention, even though it's not old timey. All right. Bye, everybody.